Good afternoon, and welcome to the Dennis Sharp Writing Prize, which is part of the History and Theory program here at the AA. So this morning there was presentations by first, second, and third year students, and this afternoon we have presentations from fourth and fifth year students. The day is sort of separated into two types of writing. One are essay-based pieces which take part in term one of the year, and the other pieces are theses, and we'll see four of them, in which they're started sort of during year four and then continue into year five, and students have to declare for writing for those. So this is the first year we're dividing them, and we think it's quite important because there are obviously very different approaches to writing, much longer time frame, much larger bodies of research for the theses, where the essays are, as I said, like they're in about a 2-month time frame. So hopefully that goes well. With that, as I said, as you're speaking, anyone, please have the microphone close to you or in your hand, because people are watching on Zoom and they can't hear us if we don't have the microphone. Dennis Sharp Prize itself, obviously Dennis Sharp was an architectural historian, critic, designer, practitioner, and he is a student of the AA and also taught here and introduced many important journals within the school and was a champion of writing within the school and disseminating that. And so the award is honored after his contribution to the school and to the larger, wider architectural community. So I think with that, as we have a lot of presentations to go through today, I'm going to pass the microphone to our critics, and they can introduce themselves.
Hi, Ed Bottoms, Head of Archives and teacher at HCS.
Hi, I'm Richard Aina. I was a student last year. I won the Dennis Sharp Prize last year as well.
Hi, I'm Catherine Dutoy. I am a member of council. I also studied here a long time ago and taught here for a while.
Hello, I'm Helen Castle and I'm Publishing Director at REBA, overseeing the journal and also the books and the Journal of Architecture as well and the bookshop.
Hi, Nick Simchikareze, Assistant Professor of Urban Studies at the University of Cambridge. I studied here, diploma in 2009-10. It's really nice to see this buffet of ideas. I was here this morning too, to see how it continues. Very excited to see.
And with that, I'll pass it over to our first students presenting. We have Leticia, we have Gaetano, and we have Aayat. So I'll pass it over to you. 5 minutes. I'll start putting my hand up if it starts to go a bit long so we can keep on time. Okay?
Hello, so my name is Leticia, and my essay is titled An Ode to Silence, and it's basically an inventory of silences, or what I define as a silence is all of the noises that we live around. And it's basically something that I have been doing over 5 years, and I wanted to use the essay as an opportunity to explore the medium of the archive. And so the way that my video is composed is in 3 different movements. You have the prelude, which is kind of a critique on how the archive is becoming a digitalized medium. And then the second part is the interlude, which is an exchange between film and sound. And the last part is the deflection of that archive in order to see what can come out of the meeting of the video and the sound. And so now I will play the film. The archive is a space of encounter. It is a unique experience to make discoveries and bring back glimpses of the past. The digitalization of the archive has lost an essential fragment of the process. What happened to the ritual of the found material? To archive is to reminisce, decide what is valuable, organize and sort this resource to experience someone's memories. A nod to silence is an invitation to reclaim the meaning of the archive. This film is the making of silences collected over the years. The juxtaposition of images and sounds portrays an unequivocal narrative. While sound alone can prompt fragments of the past, the film aims to exhibit a process. By sharing the making of my collection, I encourage others to take part in this journey and look back on the accumulation of material they have stored. Find this web of tangible or intangible objects. Rejoice in the chaos of archiving. The afterlife of the collection of material is an opportunity for others to enter one's fabricated story. A mise en scène is built around the experience of the collected items. A ritual is born. What would the city be like without its sounds? Silence lies in the distant humming of the streets, and this beautiful melody inhabits the fabric of our routine. But to notice this rhythm, one must begin with a walk, a nameless journey. Not unlike a flaneur, one must lose himself in the soundscape, and in this sense, psychogeography is an instrument to pave the way into this voyage. This notion can be read as the emotional effects of physical environments to sail through the city. By drifting, one is guided by their instincts, and in doing so, the focus becomes the details, lying dormant in the background, unnoticed and invisible to the naked eye. Both stimulated and agitated, one must use psychogeography to navigate this tangled web of murmurs. Suffocating in a sea of thoughts, I went on a promenade to feast on what Honoré de Balzac once referred to as the gastronomy of the eyes. In search of a moment of peace, I wandered around the streets guided by the echoing voices of the city. And these white noises, be it the humming of a car, the train passing by, became the cure to my distress. Through this experience began the recording of the silence. Most often triggered whilst on promenades, I kept evidence of these sounds and started building my collection. Now and again, I felt the need to reflect back on these moments, to listen to those murmurs of the past. The nature of this archive is to compose an inventory of silences that can be listened to, deflected, or shared with others.
Use that one as well.
Thank you, Leticia. Thank you, Leticia.
Sorry.
That's okay. All right, Gaetano, when you're ready.
Hello, my name is Gaetano. And The Head, the Face, the Mask, a love story beyond the beautiful monster is an essay that tries to understand what can be defined as beautiful and what can be defined as ugly through the legend of the Moor's Head. The legend takes place in Palermo in Sicily during the Arabic domination of the island. And it goes like that. A girl standing on her balcony was seduced by an exotic and stranger man, Amour, and fell in love with the man. The two started a passionate relationship that concealed a secret. The man would have to go back to his homeland, to a wife and children. When this day came, and the Sicilian girl realized the situation, during the night she chopped the head of the Moor and emptied it of the soft organs. She then planted a plant of basil inside the head and placed it in her balcony, watering it every day with her tears. The people, seeing the beautiful pot on the girl's balcony, began to make clay pots resembling Moors' heads, a tradition we still have today. The story hides several monsters that shift schizophrenically from one side to the other. The young girl represents the pureness and it represents beauty, but it quickly shifts to a murderous monster. The Moor represents exoticism and seduction, but it quickly shifts to otherness and the invader. And in here, Sigmund Freud, in one of his texts of The Uncanny, helps in the understanding of this duality. With the German words heimlich and unheimlich. Heimlich means familiar, cozy, but it can also mean concealed. Unheimlich means unfamiliar, revealed, or something that was hidden and is now visible. And because of the journeys of the definitions of these two terms, they share the same meaning, a third meaning, which is uncanny. So they're actually not opposite words, but they become just different parts of the same whole. And the monster is uncanny. And it is uncanny because it always stays in the dark spaces of the house. And that's where the pure wants it to stay. But what the pure forgets is that dark spaces of the house are as part of the house as the ones in light, and their difference is not as strong as they thought. The fluidity of the elements of the Moor's head are very particular because they're not of a Moor and they're not of a Sicilians, but they are the hybrid of the two culture when they came in contact. The other, the Muslim, it represents by the fact that the legend wants to portray also the struggle between the self and the other, where the self is represented as Christianity, as Sicily, and the other is represented as the Islamic invasion. So the Moor represents Islam, and the Sicilian girl represents Christianity. And the legend represents the constant struggle of defining what is accepted and what is not accepted in the two sides. And particularly with the Borgia map that was produced by the Christendom, the heads were a very particular symbol and element, and it was how the Islamic parts of the words were represented, using heads of monsters, so that people could think that Islam was seen as non-pure and as grotesque. The border between the two entities are the only things that keeps them separate, and just the idea that the one could leak into each other's interior is enough to create repulsion in the self. But in reality, they are just, they're not opposite, but they're just mirror reflections of each other. The idea of beauty and ugly being opposite, it's something that who claims to be pure cannot accept, and that's why it needs to annihilate the monster, cage it or kill it. Only after this act, the pure, the self, realizes that it became the monster itself, and it acquired the same elements that fought before. The story moves farther from the domestic space to the urban space, to the balcony. The limits of the house, of the self, have collapsed, and they have produced a hybrid space. And the hybrid space is how Palermo looks today. And it's the the hybrid that came into place from the different dominations. You cannot get rid of the monster because the fight between the self and the other is nothing more than a game of mirrors. All of the characters are wearing masks that hide their true identities. And the feeling of unease is created by being aware of that mask. And this condition is underlined by Sicilian author Luigi Pirandello that writes, "The idea that others saw in me one that was not the I who I knew, one whom they alone could know, as they looked at me from without, with eyes that were not my own, eyes that conferred upon me an aspect destined to remain always foreign to me, although it was one that was in me, one that was in my own to them, a mine, that is to say, that was not for me. A life into which, although it was my own, I had no power to penetrate. This idea gave me no rest." And the fear of the monster is not given by its element, but it's given by the idea that behind the mask, you can see the similarities with the monsters. So the heads become the symbols of realms populated by monsters. They are attacked solely on the basis of existing and jeopardizing all that is pure. And Coriamenta's Sicilian artist chooses the Moor's head as an artifact that is intrinsic of controversy to represent the struggle between what is considered normal and what is considered abnormal. Every love story is a ghost story. The love between the Sicilian girl and the Moor's head will never die. It will endure in the contamination between the two cultures. Palermo is a love story with its unprecedented Christian buildings, which are built in Islamic architectures and elements such as the Muqarnas. Basil itself is a peculiar choice for the legend. It's a plant with a strong symbolism that itself fights between uncanny meanings. In ancient Rome, its significance was hostility, and in medieval times in Italy, it was the plant that women gifted to men as a marriage seal. So within the same country, the meaning shifted. So the monster and the pure, the self and the other, the Christian and the Muslim, the Sicilian girl and the Moor, are not opposing characters of the story, but they exist as definition of one another. Do you believe you can know yourself if you don't somehow construct yourself? Or that I can know you if I don't construct you in my way? And can you know me if I don't construct you in my way? We can know only what we succeed in giving form to. Thank you.
My essay examines the rise of Instagrammable spaces in the context to a convoluted timeline of economical, socio-cultural, and architectural developments that have paved a way for the image-obsessed society we live in, and the consequences this phenomena produces for architecture as a discipline and for us as its practitioners. To begin with, I'd like to present my curiosity in exploring this subject. As a person, I am, as some in this room may be, and many in this world are, addicted to this tiny screen in my hand. It enables me to disappear into a void of unlimited, unquestioned consumption of ideas, of emotions, of projections, presented to me through a series of images and audio, devoid of any tangible qualities of either space or time. And as somebody studying architecture for the last 6 years, Instagram has been an unmissable pit stop in unraveling everything about the architectural ecosystem, from Starchitects to the ongoing commentary on their obsessions with phallic symbolism, to the tales of David taking on Goliath, down to the indistinguishable student work feeds and visual diaries, created in a desperate attempt to be found and validated. Instagram has captured it all. So, really, how did we get here? The obvious first is its economics, more specifically the insidious cocktail of profit meets unregulated tech, otherwise known as platform capitalism, enacting as a ground in which various user activities take place. Digital platforms are able to profit from these interactions by means of collecting data. The more data gathered, the more predictable its users, the more addictive the algorithm becomes. The more users it gets, and the cycle continues, creating a mammoth that devours everything to continually ensure its own survival. Beyond capitalism, the cultural superiority of optics, it can be traced to the Greeks, who touted vision, the noblest of senses. The invention of perspective during the alleged Renaissance made the eye the center point of the perceptual world, as well as the concept of the self. The onset of modernism not only sustained this hegemony of the eye, but also heightened its negative inclinations through a myriad of technological inventions, turning imagery into a mesmerizing flow of abstractions without focus or participation. The domination of a device that carries both the camera and the electronic screen, i.e. a smartphone, is thus a testament to this long-standing history of the hegemony of the eye. I'd like to present my research into Baudrillard's theories of sign value, systems of objects, and the hyperrealism through my actual Instagram feed. Through this carefully curated set of photographs, I have chosen to be read through what I observe and capture, and through it determine my worth as an architect. For long, I've done this to seem more mysterious, artsy, and less shallow. In short, like every other person in architecture. Like most of us here, I have subscribed to this intangible language of objects and spaces and used it to locate myself within it. But this is not who I am, rather who I'd like to appear as. This tension between the actual, the presented, and the perceived is the realm of the hyperreal. This realm with personas that aren't quite real, in a space that doesn't quite exist, is what constitutes spatiality in the age of Instagram. It is in this realm of pseudo-reality that contemporary architecture thrives in, consumed through a myriad of flattened images. Going back to another age, the failure of modernism, a movement so deeply manifested in the architecture of its time, was inherently a failure of its forbearing ideologues, the modern architects. An existential and ideological crisis has taken hold of the profession ever since, many suggesting its obsolescence in contemporary society. Isms after isms after isms demonstrate but one thing: architecture is on a quest to find itself. Whether good, So, can architecture's favorite shopfront, that is Instagram, and the rising demand for photogenic spaces be a ticket back to the relevance for architects? Many architects have argued that it has made Instagram has made architecture's otherwise elitist culture far more accessible to the everyday civilian, bridging the gap between intellect and experience. Whether good or bad, an opportunity does present itself. So how will we respond to the turn of architecture to stagecraft? I, for one, argue that without resistance from any source, spatial or not, a highly performative and controlled society is bound to emerge out of this continued curation of the world, with human emotion, insecurities, and struggles redacted, somewhere along the way, only to be displayed superficially along other accumulated objects, in the pursuit of self-construed fantasies that never were and perhaps will never be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's a good three pieces to start on, because it shows the diversity of different approaches and methods that we have in the History and Theory department of how one can construct a historical and theoretical piece, sometimes written, sometimes sort of filmic, challenging the notion of word in itself. I was always struck about the silence. How do I separate silence from word, from the written word? I found that quite fascinating in your piece. And also sort of have a piece, Gaetano, taking a historical artifact and unpacking that through historical research, philosophical kind of readings of it, and kind of presenting it as a modern day sort of problem, which I find fascinating, and sort of the reverse of taking a contemporary sort of technological device and platform that has completely radically changed our profession, and contextualizing that historically, kind of going backwards. So I think they're really good three pieces to start with. And with that, I'll pass it over to our critics. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Super interesting. So just super quick, a point and a question for each of your three of you. So Leticia, I was getting La Jetée Chris Marker vibes in your video. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but that's my that's my main that was my main kind of because you presented a very interpretive piece of work. I'm just going to interpret it in my own way, in a way, which is of course a story of a flaneur, right? I don't know if you've seen La Jetée, but it's someone who, traveling around the world, drifting in silence, realizes that the world is constructed in a certain way, and then becomes this kind of transcendent flaneur, right? And then you have two really interesting choices of figures, at least two, that you've focused on. One is James Baldwin, walking through Paris, and the other is Jeb Gambardella from La Grande Bellezza, the Great Beauty. And they're really different people. I think in fact it was James Baldwin who said that an African-American man can't be a flaneur, right? Because they're so observed, they can't disappear. Right? So I'm wondering if that's something that you're thinking of, because in a way, I think he's like the flaneur in La Jetée. He's transcendent. He sees so well that he's above the fray. So this is what came up. I wonder if it came up for you or not. Gaetano, super, super interesting, because in a world of kind of cancel culture and what's problematic and what's not, you've found something that kind of hacks the whole question right open, because it presents like a counter-colonial and colonial narrative that's all mashed up together and complicates it. So I really liked it. I really liked your presentation, but to be a bit annoying, do you think that the Moor's Head should be canceled? The Moor's Head should be canceled. Do you think it should be canceled? I mean, it's an annoying question, and there isn't, I think, a right answer. But and you used the word annihilation a little bit too much. And then thirdly, you've persuaded me to re-delete my Instagram. Thank you. I just had a kid, so I spent a lot of time at home. Kind of don't want it around him. But I'm wondering, just like there's platform capitalism, there's also platform cooperativism. I'm wondering if you think that possibility of platform cooperativism would lead to a different spatiality, or not.
Should we be answering? Can I? Okay.
Yes. I mean, it's a reflection. There's no right or wrong answer. Just hear it.
I mean, would it be a different platform? Because like the very premise of a platform is to extract until it's like a very ever-going system of extraction, and it works for profit. So, I mean, it would be I don't think there is an escape out of capitalism if you use the very devices of capitalism, because they're wired like that. Yeah. So no.
For your comment, I don't think it should be cancelled, and I think that's also part of what it's unpacked in the essays. The idea that I think the legend starts out as a very simplistic way of framing where an artifact comes from, and if it's just placed historically in the context of a domination, then the Moor's Head just becomes the pride of the population that was dominated in winning the sort of invaders. But I think what the essay is also trying to argue is that the Moor's Head is not necessarily the invader's head, but it's the hybrid son of the two, and how a lot of the Sicilian culture comes from Arabic, and I think the Moor's Head, and I think when I say that the Moor's Head is nor Moor nor a Sicilian, and the fact how it's explained in the essay that you find a Moor's Head that has really light skin and that has Sicilian patterns on the sort of headgear, which are actually not historically true, but they are sort of true to the culture of the place.
To answer to your question, well, I think that I'm happy that you were able to kind of take your own interpretation of the film, because that's kind of also the idea.
I missed the point entirely.
No, I think it is, because it's all about sounds. I think that it does give the freedom to kind of take your own approach to it. And the two characters that you mentioned, I think they both represent different sides to what a flaneur can be. And I think that for the case of James Baldwin, for me, he's a very interesting character. And I think he might represent the, I'm not sure how to explain this properly, but I think he has an approach, especially in that interview when he's walking around in Paris. For me, there's something that's very kind of psychogeographic linked. And I think that's why I chose him as one of the characters that I wanted my film to kind of highlight and show, like all of the different facades that a flaneur can take, so that it's not, the typical image that you have, that it's kind of, everyone can take part in this journey and kind of start this process.
I'll take the mic. Anti-clockwise. I just want to ask you, each one in turn, a little bit about your argument or your thesis really behind it. First of all, I want to say to you, congratulations on a really beautiful film. It was lovely, very poetic. But I was grappling with what is the message, what is the thesis, what is the argument, because it's a piece of writing, so it's something persuasive to me. And I was a little bit confused about the definitions in terms of silence and noise and what you were kind of trying to draw out of that. And perhaps I missed something. So if you could tell us what you felt your thesis or your argument was for your piece, I'd really like to know more.
So for me, when I started to, I think maybe it's more important that I start by defining what I mean by silence. Because it's something, as I was gathering all of these sounds on my phone, I started to really notice that whenever I was going outside, instinctively, one of the first things that I was doing, if I was maybe 10 minutes into a walk, would be to take my phone and kind of record when something was happening. And that's when I started to notice that these noises that are around us, we don't really pay so much attention to. And so in the same way that you go on, if you were to go on like an Emily's jury and let your instincts guide you, I thought that for me the sounds were doing that. And that's when I realized that they were considered to be silences because you don't really notice them. And so the aim of my essay was to kind of present that idea that these noises are part of our life and they're much more valuable than we think.
So you're wanting to foreground the kind of everyday sounds
exactly.
that we think are silent. I think, well, that's kind of good to know. But I did really like the fact that you did it as a 3-part piece, I think, as well, because that gave it a shape. In terms of your writing on Instagram, again, I want to ask you a little bit more about the thesis behind it, and I thought there could be more steps to it. You know, what does it do to design itself? The fixation on seeing and image. I don't know if you've read Juhani's book, Plasma's book, Eyes of the Skin, and you know, the effect on how you design because you're not projecting into space, because you're always designing from the point of view of an image.
So I think I would also like to say that Juhani's book was one of the things that have inspired me to write this. I think when you, so what I've tried to explore is what are all the different reasons that might compel you to design in such a fragmented, flat way. And it could be for a profit-based reason, or it could be the domination of the eye, or the obsession with objects and associating yourself with them. And I think Juhani in his book argues for the stimulation of different senses, and there have been many architects in history that have tried to engage with that idea. One is Carlo Scarpa with Castel Vecchio. I remember like walking through a bunch of bushes, and he's planted thyme and basil in them, so whenever you walk, you can smell it. And it's like it's something a phone can't capture. So like thinking beyond the screen, how would you design? And that's something I'm interested in exploring more. But this essay was more of my, like a start towards that argument, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's more than fair enough. You've only got so much space after all. I think also it's going to be interesting to see what happens when you have a whole generation of designers who've kind of consumed images from Instagram go into practice, really. In terms of the Moor's Head as well, I think it was a really interesting moment for you to do this. Obviously, we've had Ukraine being invaded. We're looking at, there's a kind of perpetual motion within politics of the geography of politics that encourages which certain territories get invaded over time. And obviously Sicily has this long history. You walk into the cathedral at Syracuse and you find it's a Greek temple inside. Everything, it's like a pattern of invasion, and certain areas of the world have that pattern. And I think that's really interesting and a really apt thing to explore. What thesis do you think you can bring out of that, really?
I think the idea started with the work from Mark Cousins on the ugly, and sort of this idea that two opposites are not always opposite. And I think with the Moor's Head, obviously, it shifts the concept to a more perhaps territorial and geographical idea of what are borders and what are differences between two sides. So I think what the thesis is with the Moor's Head is that what is considered a monster is not necessarily a monster just because to define that you have to put it against you, and so you just became part of the picture because you are against the monster, and you need your presence and your profile and yourself to define it. And without the monster, you see that you actually don't have a part of you anymore. And I think the legend has also this idea towards the end, in the part where she waters the plant with her tears, which is this idea of this realization that she came in contact with a part of herself that she didn't know, which was behind her mask. And just after realizing that that part is not there anymore, she also realizes that a part of herself is now missing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. A slightly different angle, although I very much recognized, the Chris Marker feeling, and I loved the bits of Lisbon story that were in there as well in the film. One of the things about silence is, I struggle with tinnitus a lot, and so actually being in the city and the way that we respond to that, just on a very, very physical level, I think is something that is not very much spoken of. And so I think your work has an enormous capacity to really raise that, and I enjoyed it so much. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the London Sound Archive at all, or if you know anything about animal life, for example. If you're in the forest and you're a robin or a wren, you might sound like Barry White, but when you come into the city, because there's so much extra noise now, you actually sound like Michael Jackson, much higher, much faster. And so the impact on us, physically is quite profound. And I suppose that's sort of the line of questioning that I wanted to sort of raise to each of you, because although this is a writing prize, I'm finding that the way that you're actually presenting it now is very different to the way that I experienced it. Not the film, because it was effectively the same thing. But Gaetano, you know, I was so, when I read your work, I was so taken by your initial story, the telling of the legend at the beginning. And then as I moved forward with the rest of your thesis, I found it was written with perhaps a different voice. Whereas when you've just presented it now, it became somehow, because you didn't read it, I found it personally far more accessible than I'd found it on the page. And I loved the illustrations, and I'd like to hear more about those. And then well, we've talked about this a little, Helen's raised it, but this question of, can you actually speak about a building or have a view of it if you haven't visited it, in not just seen a photograph, but actually been there? And it ties into, you know, what it sounds like, what it smells like. You mentioned that, and I just really wonder about what it means for us going forward if we're only seeing things as a visual construct, two-dimensional.
Well, I really liked what you said about the kind of shift that you have coming from, let's say, the countryside to arriving to the city, because it's true that you can kind of drown in this noise. So I think that it's not something that is really enjoyable. You know, when you think about having the sound of the ambulance and all of these things, sometimes it can be overwhelming, and it's just not something you want to, you just want to have like a peace and quiet environment to live in. But I really just started to pay attention to this so much more as I was like recording everything everywhere I went. And for me, it became almost kind of soothing in a way. And I almost felt a bit uncomfortable when it was too silent. And I wasn't, like, for me, it just became a tool and a moment that I looked for when I was going through my day. And so I think there's some kind of peacefulness that I associate with this silence.
Because to your point, it's never really silence.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why do maybe look at the London Sound Archive, which has been collecting silences for a couple of decades, I think, and just has, it's nothing until you start to really listen into it, and then you realize there's a depth.
Yeah, because you can kind of, because I looked at it a little bit, but I think there's something interesting, because by looking at those sounds, you can also associate certain cities or certain locations, which makes it even more exciting when you start to dig into this.
For me, I think, I think the Moor's Head is an object that is one of those objects that you see very often in your daily life, in your everyday life. But you actually never really understand why it's there. It's like sort of like a Christmas tree. Like, you know, you put it up every year, but you actually don't know the meaning of the tree itself. You just know that it's the symbol that you have to put every year. And that's, all of my life, I always seen the heads all over the city, all over the islands, without really questioning what they were. They were just like a part of the architecture, a part of how the facades look and how the balconies look. And I think, obviously, the essay is a bit more philosophical on this point, which I didn't bring, I believe, much in the presentation, just because I think I think concept of dualities are always really hard to keep stable. So in writing, it's, I guess, easier because you can actually elaborate on that. But I think, as a symbol, it's always been really important, and just recently I sort of like started to question it. And I think also to go back to your question, is this idea, because for example the essay was written in term 1, so also before a lot of the events that unfolded recently have happened. And it's the idea, I think, that is represented with the work by Coria Menta, which she took an artifact of the 19th century and she rebranded, she retranslated into something that it's really crucial today. And it's because as a symbol, it does take these dualities and it makes them in opposition, and it shows how they are not so opposite, are not so different from what we consider normal. So I think that the images from Coria Menta, which I added only in the second version of the essay, were really helpful to explain this. And I think the last image, the GIF, it's sort of, I think simplistically, it's all of the images that I tried for the cover page, all of the stages that I went through. And I was like, no, this I don't like, no, this I like, no, this I don't like. And then eventually I ended up with like 25 images, just to realize that at the end, I was already like choosing what is ugly and what it's not, and how do I define that? So I think the GIF itself represents all of that process, and it starts with a friend of mine who's also from Sicily, who's a girls, that becomes me, that becomes all of those stages, that becomes a pot, that becomes a cracked pot, that becomes a pot that you cannot even understand anymore. And I think it's all of this process which is unfolded in the images.
So your comment about experiencing a building without the image and actually visiting that, I think visiting a building is the ultimate, the ultimate overall experience of experiencing that space. But I think writing in itself is a very powerful tool to explore and experience a building beyond the presented image, because that opens up how you imagine it. I mean, film is still good, but it's still imagery. So I think writing is...
on, but yeah, may I also say I enjoyed the fact that you read, you were the one who also read your writing, and that was a great compliment with the work.
Thank you. And what I imagine happens when you keep designing in this two-dimensional way for images is that experience becomes just visual, or it gets reduced to being visual. And it is happening right now where experience is being commodified and sold, but it's actually just the image of, it's not the actual experience. So unless we move away from that visual culture, experience is going to become a currency, like it already is. And I think I'm very deeply interested in how you move away from that. Maybe, like you mentioned, how do you subvert the platform in itself and make it something else? Or how do you use the guidelines of the platform but do your own thing and make it, still provide an experience that goes beyond the image? I mean, there are many different possibilities. Or how do you completely just resist it and completely go beyond designing for a screen? That's just something left for exploration.
We have about 5 minutes.
Hello?
So
Okay, great.
if we can get some questions from Richard and Ed, that'd be great.
I'll be quick. Thank you, all three of you, for your presentations. Firstly, Letitia, I really liked the film. I think, having watched it at home, I think 2 nights ago, I watched it multiple times. I think particularly because it existed on the 3 different modes of representation or communication with your narration, the text on the screen, which didn't match the narration, but then also your use of layering of different films. The fact that the psychogeography was a layered experience in how you presented the film, I think that matched the acts of psychogeography, the acts of walking, multiple senses being exposed to the elements, and then dodging those who you encounter on your walk was particularly interesting. I watched that film, The Great Beauty, a couple of years ago, so it was really a nice touch to even see that, but then also trying myself to notice other iconic films that you had maybe sampled into that. I almost felt as if that the film was almost a preamble to another film, and this was almost like your initial experiment of presenting sound and film in this manner. And I'm quite intrigued to see how, if you were to carry this forward without even having an introduction, and you conveyed this film alone, what that would look like. And if you're able to successfully communicate the idea without an introduction, and how much further you can take this, maybe as opposed to it being sort of the agent is removed from the film, if you then see that individual in the first person, and how this can extrapolate. But also additionally with the sound, I was wondering, because having worked film myself, you know, like on what's the software, is it Premiere Pro, you yourself can start to edit the sounds. So I was wondering if in making this film you'd edited the sounds yourself, or maybe within the line of your thesis, is it better not to edit the sounds at all and not to splice anything? And if that's a better representation of what you're trying to communicate? There's no right answer to that question. But also with Gaetano, I was really interested how you're able to convey quite a fundamental argument on various scales with the individual, the self, the couple, the domesticity, the border, the cityscape. And I was reading this in my mind, the word zeitgeist became quite prominent. And it was very poignant that you then mentioned the word yourself towards the latter part. I think when you mentioned sort of the interior architecture, the light, the darkness, and then that made with me that contrast, almost the architecture of the mind. And that lightness and darkness, the monster for me seemed like sort of the internal fight we have as humans between the idea of good and evil. And was that a fundamental battle that you were trying to convey through the allegory of the monster? And also interestingly, just the notion of material culture and the appropriation of objects, the appropriation of visual culture, and how this manifests itself, and how sometimes these stories, these traditions, these rituals have meanings to a larger truth, and how us as humans, as groups, as collectives try to appropriate trauma to suit our own narrative, and how sort of, as you said, the spectre of the Moor changed over time to suit what the people look like, and that appropriation is quite interesting. So thank you. Lastly, Aayat, I find it really, I've watched 2 documentaries, you may have watched them yourself, with good references by Adam Curtis, which looks at Edward Benet's The Century of Self, which is the 4-part documentary you can find on YouTube, and also I think before his most recent one, Hypernormalization. And I think, yeah, just like the commodification of data, the commodification of how the digital commodification of experience then extrapolates into architecture, and how then this devalues architecture, but also in of itself, the devaluing of experience has increased with the devaluing of construction, how it's in of itself is removed. So maybe as much as we have a dislike for how architecture experience has become commodified, maybe the construction process haven't helped that either, and maybe it's just a byproduct of how time has elapsed. It's quite interesting. I wonder what your opinion, like maybe in 50 years from now, based on your prior research, how you think things could actually look. Obviously, we have these idealistic dreams of how things could change, but it isn't always the case. Not to say that things will be dystopian, of course, but I think I was going to say something else, which I may have forgotten. I think I've lost the thought, unfortunately, but thank you very much.
Sorry, I forgot the last part of your question, but I'll answer
the sound element, and maybe if like the splicing sound, if you did that in your film, is it something that's maybe the right or wrong thing to do?
So, firstly, for the sound, I think for me, the essay was an opportunity to kind of use this archive that I realized that I had, because it's something that I started to do, I would say almost unconsciously. And then once I opened my voice memos on my phone, that's when I realized that I had voice recordings for like the last 5 years. And so I wanted to see how I could use the essay as an opportunity maybe to deflect those sounds or to use them. And so when I was making the film, I did edit all of the audios and try to like mix match all of the recordings that I had, because some were taken, all of them were taken in completely different places. And I thought actually, as I was overlaying images, that it would be interesting to also have an overlay of these sounds and see how they would work together. And so I really enjoyed what you were saying about it being almost like an introduction to something more, because it was the first, my first encounter into actually opening up this wall and like realizing all that I had collected. And so I think it would have a pursuit in the future. But it was just an enjoyable moment to kind of put these together and see also how sound and the films that I had, how I could kind of deflect all of those elements and create a sort of drift between the videos and the silences.
I think Evil and Good was not necessarily the source of the idea, but I think it is part of the same complexity. It represents also a dichotomy of two elements, which, like for example, the Heimlich and Unheimlich, is this idea that one means something that was hidden and is now visible, and that is kind of a secret, which is the meaning of its apparent opposite, and that's why they sort of like through a journey find the similarities that they had, which are sort of like hidden behind all of that sort of like steps of definitions and meaning. So I think Evil and Good, in that sense, they are also this sort of apparent these struggles between one trying to protect their border to avoid the other leaking inside, to just discover that at the end that leakage is actually not toxic or harmful. It's just like either similarities or things that can sort of like converge into a hybrid.
Okay, cool. So I wasn't sure if there was a question.
I think the main question was based on your research of how things have progressed historically. Within the shortest space of time, how do you think things would be, say, 15 to 50 years from now? Do you have idealistic hopes, or if this was to be carried forward, would this even increase the commodification of space and experience?
Okay, I think like in the next 20 years, the planet's gonna die. So that's a thing to begin with, because but that's very pessimistic, and the sort of studies that I am engaging with right now, or the sort of theory that I'm picking up, does present different, even though idealistic, many different ways in which we can get out of this. But that would obviously require like regime changes and stuff like that. In terms of architecture, architecture is a product of the society. So as long as the society doesn't change, I think it's too hopeful of us to expect architecture to actually, bring that change. But I do want to hope, and I do hope that our generation of architects do actually do something. But yeah, the climate crisis is for real, so there's nothing beyond that for me at this point. Sorry.
Great, thank you for your answers. I would say in response, there's a project by Dewey Priest from last year, which you can look into, which focuses on quite similar notions of commodification of experience. And Letitia, I think, lastly, it could be very difficult, but maybe if you actually just look into one a day of walking, and you don't edit any of that sound, and you then try and reinterpret that through visual material, it could be quite interesting, but very difficult. But yeah. Thank you, guys.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Enjoyed all of them. Obviously, I'm biased, but Letitia, I'll start with you. I think there's something else in there that you could bring out a little bit stronger, perhaps, and that's this whole issue of the silences in the archive. So it's in a not quite so literal fashion as you're talking about silence, but the way voices are hidden in the archive, in the same way that your silences are hidden within the city. You don't hear them until you highlight. So I think what you're doing really is quite sophisticated in that you're critiquing the archive, and you're trying to bring these silences out through a derive, through this kind of drift through the archive. You're questioning the structures of the archive that create these or silence the voices, or create these silences. So I think that's an element that possibly is bubbling under the surface. But I think that's a really kind of powerful kind of thing to have. So I think I really enjoyed that aspect of it. Gaetano, great kind of essay, great presentation. I've got some kind of questions. You had this is going off at a bit of a tangent, so bear with me. But you had the pre-Raphaelite painting of the name changes, doesn't it? But it's the same legend. It starts with Boccaccio, and then it goes through Keats and through to the pre-Raphaelites, etc. So these guys are finding exactly the same story, compelling, but for different reasons. And I'm wondering if this story kind of fits into the kind of Salome type, the archetype of the dangerous woman, the threat to masculinity, and whether you can draw something out of that, whether you can make that an additional. I don't think it detracts from what you're saying at all, but you might be able to work that in somehow. Questions, well, in the kind of art historical mode, instantly I see the vase. What's the date? You know, when are these coming out? Is that a 19th century one? Is that 16th century? The story's 10th century, is it not 9th century origins? What periods, be precise, what periods in history are these coming to the fore? Is it the 1860s? Is it the 1940s at times of, political, social... Yeah.
I think it's just because it's really hard to define when they started. No one really knows, and the only explanation for them is the legend. There's no actual, real facts on why they started.
Fair enough. And then the final thing, I thought it's really interesting what you talk about, the uncanny. And there is a whole field of literature out there about the uncanny, certainly in literary studies in the last kind of 5-6 years. So I think that would, in the text, it might be good to read a little bit more theory on that, other than Freud and Mark. But I think that would really help, I think, build it up. I thought yours was great. I thought it was really, really interesting. I felt very old. My one, I think everybody said everything kind of complimentary, and so I'm only left with a critical question, in the sense that I wonder if, and this comes out more in the text, I wonder if you're doing a critique of the commodification, devaluation, the oversimplification, then in your text, it would help your argument if you can be super precise, if you can give more evidence of this. You can be more quantitative, maybe, and you can give more sources. And I think that would really build the argument. But I hope that's not too an underhanded kind of...
That's appreciated, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. That's really, really interesting.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Really great presentations and really nice discussion, which is evidence of some really good work. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so if I can ask the next 4 students to come up, Vedika, Seonwoo, Zekun, and Min.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Vedika, and my essay kind of brings and starts being a story that begins at the riverbanks of the Ganges, a place where the Kumbh Mela festival in India happens. So this is a Hindu religious festival that occurs every 12 years at the confluence of 2 rivers, with about 120 million people coming and attending for a bathing ritual of 49 days. The river itself is an entity that's given an immense love and admiration, where the river has a right of legal persons as well. So there is a mass transformation that's occurring at this river, and 7 months, 200 10 days, 5,040 hours later, there are spaces created for this extended community that gather for these religious rituals. So, through my essay, I tried to distinguish the difference between a ritual and a habitat, where the ritual is being related to a religion and then a habitat that is being prescribed and ordered, where a ritual is annual and a habit being daily, making the ritual extraordinary. And it questions that when you create a space, do you do it in a certain way based on the ritual, or are we just using the wrong tool and the tool can be temporal as well? And the story begins in small towns across the river in areas of Allahabad, where there are very detailed and prescribed materials that are collected and organized with specific length, diameter, and material types. And the community space that is being used is the first spatial infrastructure that is constructed by the people by using their own bodies. Throughout the essay, there's also chosen protagonists, characters that I've tried to give life throughout this preparation, and the use of the screenplay in the essay is not only for artistic purposes, but it attempts to bring life the essence of each chapter, as well as clarify with handwritten notes the meaning of each word in each scene, where each character, the farmer from a lower class, a politician, the architect, and the priest, and show how the entire construction is transgenerational. Each character has a purpose and a role within the making of this ritual. And the scene tries to capture the raw moment of these relationships with the river through flashbacks, as an elderly man tries to describe his experience at first encounter with the river. And it's a way of attempting to understand the social, cultural, and religious aspects of many different places, where the terrain itself that the festival is built on is very convoluting, as it's forever changing. It's in a state of liminal. It's not static in nature, and therefore the appropriation through different tools depends on the terrain itself, where the entire Kumela comprises of smaller parts that are constructed over a period of time. And during the monsoon season, where there are children playing within the lines of the land, there are different meetings being held between these actors and different relations being talked about. The materials that are brought on rickshaws and autos from the villages are then moved into these vacant spaces near the floodplain. And with the water levels changing and receding by the end of October, more the first ground is being leveled and the initial grid is being deployed. So why do we always assume that everything is forever? We're not, and so why should our institutions be? And by the ritual being an act that does not occur every day, it could become even more impactful. Where a ritual is a repetitious bodily behavior and is distinguished from common behavior. It is very much a meticulous choreography based on a script. The construction of the festival involves the entire body in vigorous rhythmic movements, which include the movement of the materials, the tying of the materials, the dances, which include the swaying and the slapping of the chest and thighs, and the stamping as every sector is constructed. The repetition of the tools and the movement of people as they construct is vital to understand how the ritual works, and the repetition enforces this familiar order and organization of the ritual and ceremony. And while there is no aspiration for this construction to be permanent, but only be repeated, the idea is to allow the Ganges to flow and reclaim the site. It's not an antagonistic approach and an open template for people to appropriate and materialize. The tools are changing, but in every way still being prescribed, with the structure being time-based throughout the essay as well, and throughout the climax, in the end, becomes the time of the festival when the ritual happens. But also, what I found as I wrote the essay, there's also the dismantling of the whole festival and the scene that appears to have a very important aspect. The moment where the architecture becomes readable in a possible dialogue with nature instead of becoming a permanent formal oppression. So the narrative is something that's to be delivered where the river is an infrastructure and the smaller rituals behind the larger rituals become important, where the infrastructure is a ritual in itself, which creates a sense of grounding and a sort of necessity being put forward. The making of the ritual stage is being built in a liminal state, or a state of limbo, where people have not begun the transition to the status that they will hold once the ritual is complete, but where the festival happens, and when it happens, is not as important than the preparation it takes to set up this stage. And it focuses on dissecting with care and originality and the preparation and the construction of the event, where the architecture allows for a buffer to be implemented, where the river is protected, organized, and regulated. And the sense of obscurity that occurs of the ritual itself is what's interesting. The preparation for this festival requires immense cooperation and organization, where there's a temporal ritual stage being created, which is so intricate and malleable that it's constantly evolving and being reappropriated. Thank you.
Well done on time as well. Seonwoo, you're next.
Do you want to come?
Hi, it's this one. Hi, my name is Seonwoo, and my essay is a celebration of a drawing and its misreadings that spans 3 generations, 1909, 1978, and 1981. First, the original. If there ever were a genre of real estate poetry, this would be it. Buy a cozy cottage in our still-constructed choice lots, less than a mile above Broadway, only 10 minutes by elevator, all the comforts of the country with none of its disadvantages, by Celestial Real Estate Company. In March 1909, a full-page cartoon made its appearance on Life magazine under the issue Real Estate Number. The cartoon depicts an 84-story steel frame within which a foliage of American homes unfold, with its porches, gardens, gazebos, and stables. The floors are connected by a single elevator shaft crowned with a hexagonal roof and a flag, giving it a quaint look of a medieval watchtower. Each floor is with its landing platform to which the aerocabs drop off and whisk away the celestial inhabitants. Under the flock of clouds that surround the tower is the old skyline of the city, dwarfed in the presence of the new Babylon. The author, Alanson Burton Walker, was a successful cartoonist, featuring regularly in Life, Harper's Saturday Evening Post, known for his fluid line and gentle humor. His favorite subjects were cutting-edge technologies of the times, stretched to the point of absurdity, not only to glimpse into the future, but more importantly, to expose the follies of those who capitalize on it, whether it be the bourgeoisie or the suffragettes. By depicting the desire for comforts of the country in the most literal manifestation as cottages in the sky, Walker allows the reader to acquire critical distance to be aware of the false promises of the market and the inconsistencies in his own demands. 1978, the first misreading. In Delirious New York, Rem Koolhaas reveres the 1909 cartoon as a theorem that prescribes the ideal performance of the skyscraper. Right after Walker's drawing, Koolhaas places Harry Petit's extravagant illustration featured in King's Dream of New York. By aligning the two drawings together, Koolhaas charges Walker's humorous cartoon with the same prophetic energy of Petit's realist rendering. Why did Rem prioritize Walker's drawing before Petit's? Why did the 1909 cartoon become a theorem over other visions of the future? While Petit vividly captured the outward magnificence of skyward construction, his drawing failed to visualize the real urban breakthrough. In Petit's New York, the infinite repetition of the floors does not interrupt the skyscraper. Its facade remains unperturbed by the myriads of metropolitan life that is reaching its climax within its envelope. In contrast, the 1909 theorem makes it transparent what is truly at stake when life continues upwards, a complete and brutal fracturing of life between the floors. Right above the cosmopolitan couple hailing an airplane, see the donkey shrinking back from the height. In his book, Koolhaas crops out the original caption from the fictional Celestial Real Estate Company and instead writes his own copy for the beloved. 1909 theorem, the skyscraper as utopian device for the production of unlimited number of virgin sites on a single metropolitan location. Strangely, in Koolhaas's reading, there is complete lobotomy of countryside. Instead, the cottages serve only as a metaphor. The stylistic variation of the villas represents simply the indeterminacy of the internal programs of the skyscraper. The real appeal for Koolhaas were not the cottages, but the neutrality of the steel framework. The instability of the interior of the skyscraper magnifies its gravitational field, absorbing the city and repelling life outside of it. Kidnapped by Rem, the 1909 cartoon matures into a sinister messenger of the zeitgeist. The utopian vision of the countryside life within the city is usurped by the final triumph of the city over all other forms of life. 1981, misreading 2. Where Koolhaas saw a metaphor, James Wines saw a solution. Parodying the 1909 cartoon, Wines produces a series of drawings in 1981 under the title High Rise of Homes. In The Architecture, published in 1987, he writes, "This project is an experimental condominium prototype of 8 to 15 stories high, intended for construction in the major city center. The U-shaped steel and concrete structure supports a vertical community of private houses whose style is chosen by individual residents, clustered into a village-like compounds on each floor. Even in the original cartoon, the detached homes had been a proxy for real estate desires. However, in High Rise of Homes, the College of Cottagers stand for nothing else but itself as homes. Wine's great radicality lay in the absence of interpretation. By 1981, Wines had already mastered the suburban typology and the fact that cars had become more like homes and homes had become more like cars. This subversion was portrayed earlier in the Ghost Parking Lot project in 1978, where cars became the permanent landscape. High Rise of Homes is an inversion of the Ghost Parking Lot. High Rise of Homes is a car park where one parks his home and the ready-made subplots on the still frame. For REM, the 1909 cartoon illustrated an internal diaspora of programs within the skyscraper. For Wines, the migration is external. High Rise of Homes offers a return ticket to those who left the city in favor of the suburbs, but who can no longer afford its sprawls. Wines was genuinely committed to the cottagers and its cosmetic expressions of individualism, which, however skin deep, could finally communicate a legible scale of the home within a city, and moreover offer choice of this brick or that brick, this door or that door, this lamp or that lamp. Above all else, the biggest discrepancy between the 1909 cartoon and the High Rise of Homes can be located not in its foreground, but in its background. The contradictions within the different iterations betray a deeper discontent and discomfort for the density of the city. While some depict High Rise of Homes within a clear urban setting, these versions situate High Rise of Homes within a deserted landscape overrun with vegetation. As the trees and overground grass recede into gradation of painterly dabs, the High Rise of Homes manifests itself as an orphaned monument belonging neither to the city nor to the country. If one of our generation, continuing with this misreading, if one of our generation were to follow the lineage and redraw High Rise of Homes, it would depict the homes evicted out of the steel frames or else covered with dust sheets and removable blankets. The tower might be hoarded altogether, and the site will be so familiar to us that the drawing would lose any sense of radicality. Then what do we see when we see the High Rise of Homes? Is it nostalgia, a longing for simpler times? Or are we looking at a self-portrait for the High Rise of Homes is already a ruin, a cemetery of bygone styles, a bare skeleton of a building? The High Rise of Homes is a universal idea that ends up nowhere. Style erodes. Will the steel frame crumble too? Thank you.
Greetings. Now I shall present my writing piece as a memory palace in form of a physical trunk, in tracing the archive with Ed. Museum of Memory. I'm a hoarder, no doubt. Nowadays, a proud one, unlike the diagnosis defined by the NHS. It is a struggle, though. An archive fever hits me from time to time, right now too, perhaps. It started with a suitcase when I first left home. But of course, I was I before this. I started accumulating way before this. Perhaps my archive even preceded me. This thing is older than me. The tie I'm wearing is older than me. The knowledge, I'm speaking with words, is certainly older than me as well. There is always something before everything, Dariya would say. He would also say that we are all archivists, not solely Mr. Bottom in this room. Just as ourselves, there is an inside and an outside. By having a division between the two realms, we are already playing the role of an archivist, of deciding whether to keep a memory or to dispose of it. Over time, our selves extend beyond the physical body and materialize into a physical exterior landscape. I agree, however, with the ability to consign and inscribe a trace in some exterior location, we are giving ourselves power to control our traces. Therefore, it can hardly be seen as a true depiction of ourselves. Ultimately, I seek for ways to archive my hoardings, to mourn the memories, then to materialize it into one single object, a portable archive. Perhaps one that is in many ways served the purpose as those of a Victorian Army campaign chest. but certainly one that does not require slave labor to move. In an attempt to be as objective as possible with the archive, I intend to archive everything that I am in possession of. And even after I've parted way with it, it shall remain as a written word in my archive, a memory that remains but is also gone, forgotten but will be revisited. In my mind, hoarding is, as much as archiving is in Derrida's mind, a fundamental element of being human, or potentially what makes us human, what gives us the identity, the dirt, the genuine fabric of life, which in turn project a transparent awareness of one's whole belongings, creating an exterior location for the psyche, while at the same time dissolving the power of control. I would urge all of those who is listening, don't archive merely to survive, live a life in your archive. I'm not archivist by profession, but I certainly archive for a living. This is the end, sorry. This is the end of the 5-minute presentation, but it is by no means the end of my archive. At long last, my archive shall only cease when I'm destructed. Thank you very much.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm presenting my essay, Portfolioism, a Cautionary Tale for Architecture. Cambridge Dictionary defines a portfolio as a collection of drawings, documents, and etc. that represent a person's, especially an artist's work. However, with the ever-growing number of architecture portfolios shared to online platforms such as issue.com, as well as the burgeoning tutoring industry relating to polishing portfolios for grad school admissions, the role of portfolio today seems to have outgrown its original functionality and rather became a thesis, portfolioism, that exists alongside the thesis of architecture. Oops. The AA school, according to Alvin Boyarsky, is a thermometer to reflect the larger architectural discipline outside. And for sure, the architectural discipline has become a fragmented plurality of themes. As Sarah Whiting has described, the current time of theoretical unclarity is a condition where a plethora of voices coexist without any of them powerful enough to formulate a new disciplinary direction. However, beneath the surface of 1,000 themes, is there anything that is consistent across the spectrum of architectural disciplines? Anything that might reveal where the discipline is actually going, though, probably in a way that we are perhaps unaware of. To find out, you only need to go on issue.com with some search words like architecture and portfolios. And the results are amazing, an almost curated collection of architectural projects with surprising level of homogeneity, actually. Amongst them are some incredibly well-drawn projects that share common traits that can be observed, notably the love for complex diagrammatic drawing, the eagerness to show a process of scientific rigor, and the silent presence of pseudo-random patterns. And these commonalities can be understood as a kind of unconscious of the architectural discipline, which is obviously a denial of a more conscious plurality. Despite the diverse themes within the schools, the student body seems to know a singular formula, one set of boxes to tick in order to make an appealing project overall. And therefore, we shall coin a term, portfolioism, to describe this intellectual project that exists in a utilitarian world where the artist attempts to measure himself against the weights of the talent market. And one key notion to portfolioism is the quantitative complexity. If we see portfolioism as a product of trying to stand out against competition, the anxiety of standing out mainly comes from the inability to be qualitatively different in today's fragmented discourse. In this regard, the mission of standing out falls onto the quantitative complexity of the project. In the example of Wang Zigeng's portfolio upload, one of the more popular ones on issue, each page is carefully populated with a maximum amount of density. Lines, texts, photographic materials formulate a choreography of visual impact that the viewer just cannot help but be impressed. And arguably, the same logic of overwhelming quantity can also be found in the iconic illustrations of Bartlett Unit 10, the maximalist drawings by students at AA Diploma 6, or the 3D model garbage dump that is the forms of a Mark Foster Gage proposal. Although these mentioned works belong to very different agendas and self-identify as unique investigations, they are all undeniably guilty of employing quantity as a means to gain legibility and therefore come under the examination of portfolioism. Not only does portfolioism have an online presence, it has also materialized in tangible forms of portfolio agencies. I'm not sure if you all know these, but these are the type of tutoring business that offers paid advice to students. While in their bachelor education, instead of working on studio projects under the instructions of professors alone, some students find it more helpful to seek advice from a portfolio, quote-unquote, portfolio tutor, someone who recently graduated with an elite record from an elite school to directly guide them on presentations, drawings, and many other things that make a project portfolio ready. And some of these agencies are so successful that they run their own studios, the same way that the AA runs our studios. These portfolio works, these portfolioist works, make their way to competition-winning entries and design exhibitions. After all, where is the line between a portfolio agency and an architecture school? And the last chapter of this essay compares portfolioism to a pyramid scheme. With every pyramid scheme, it is in the investor's interest to share a consensus that the scheme is ultimately creating genuine value and therefore shall continue forever. And with portfolioism, isn't it the same overlapping of interest to have all students and practitioners believe in the value and usefulness of their academic production, while the skills of making quote-unquote cool drawings, architecture narratives, or sophisticated diagrams are essential skills to becoming a capable candidate for any elite architecture school? Are they worth so much of our investment, time, and effort? And to conclude, portfolioism is a cautionary tale for architecture. It gives us a mirror to reflect upon the issues at the core of our discipline. The architecture academia could benefit from asking how much of what we do has genuine value and how much of it has value because it works in our favor. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that presentation, for all four of them. I think two of them particularly talk about architectural representation, how we represent ourselves, and also provide sort of an attack on sort of how we sort of currently disseminate information, how that information is sort of also digested, and also how misreading, I think, is a key element to analyzing architectural text and drawings, and I think that's an important topic to talk about. Of course, I quite enjoy the idea of taking an event, a time-based event that traces different cultural contexts and begins to explore how that has effects on different social classes and rituals. And I think that's a theme that I see throughout many of the papers throughout the diploma school, which is rather important. I think maybe we'll talk about that more as we go on. And then also a very personal exploration about sort of I would say a condition that many of us have, collecting, hoarding, and what to do with that material. And to connect that to archiving, I think, is quite fascinating, and to think of ourselves as embodying that is certainly worthy of discussion. And so with that, I open it up to our panelists. Maybe we'll start on this side. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's really amazing. I've really enjoyed reading all your essays and found they're all really sophisticated, and the vocabulary and the ideas are just wonderful. In the interest of kind of time, I know we're not running, we haven't got a huge amount of time. Just got one kind of general, rather boring kind of criticism or kind of comment. And it's a bit related to what I was saying again to the group before. I just feel more detail, more granular detail can help in all the essays. I just feel you're really, really good at speculating, but it's sometimes the detail can add strength to that speculation and can give it, kind of real power. I think in that sense, portfolioism, for example, I think it would have been to create a category, to define a category, you have to make absolutely sure, you have to quantify it, you have to kind of prove that it exists. And I think we're all aware that it does exist, but can you dig deeper? You talk about one platform, what other platforms are there on, how many, I know these things are really hard, it's ever shifting and it's really hard to quantify, but if you can kind of go down that route a little bit more, I think that would really, really help to actually define it. And I had a quick look using the search terms that you suggested in the essay, and there's a certain demographic which is interesting as well, which you could then bring in to the essay as well. And I think this applies to all. I'm picking up on you, but I think could do the same with absolutely every single essay. I think particularly the liminal space is really interesting because you talk about broad. You do talk really local level in the screenplay in particular, and then you talk organizational level as well. But are there any documents that you can produce? I'm really fascinated to see how, the council or the local authority or whatever produce, that kind of granular level is really, really revealing, I think, and how it kind of reinforces existing social structure, the community. So you've got the shifting event, but the continuity is the community, and that's being kind of held by. And I think having these details will help reveal that, and interviews with people maybe, or that kind of level of detail. And again, I could do it for everybody, so I'm kind of unfairly picking on you too, but that's my general kind of point. It really, when you're speculating, it really helps to give them more detail.
Thank you all for your really interesting piece of work. I'll start with who went first and then who went last. So firstly, Vedika. I really almost felt like having read a lot of ethnographic pieces in the past, I felt there was an element of ethnography in your work, but it went far beyond traditional modes of ethnography. You had a very personal touch within it, the whole narration, the sequencing of individuals, through how that manifests itself through the material culture, and then community coming together and fluctuating to create space, and that space had its own culture and its own dynamic in of itself. Even quite sensitively, how you then listed the names in the beginning. How traditionally, like in films, you have the star actor first, but then you had this more. I think it seemed like who appeared first in the story was then represented in that order sequentially. What else? I was trying to think. I think also, with your drawings as well, I really liked how sort of the detail increased with how more resolute the design became. So as the design was continually built up, that then became more actualized, and then you had those final sort of renders at the end. I think the depth at which you went to describing the whole, the sequence of things for this festival, I'm quite curious to know if this has actually become your design project. Actually, I think I'll ask everyone a question just for time, unfortunately. But because it was very in depth. I really enjoyed that. So, secondly, the High Rise of Homes, Seonwoo. That was having read work of. Sorry, I had a bit of a mind blank. Sorry. Having read Delirious New York in the past, it was very interesting to have your different take on things. I think it's actually quite similar with the work before. I think from Atia, looking at how sort of the commodification of architecture manifests itself in how this is communicated for mass consumption, the mass production of form mirrors that, and how sort of we're being sold dreams through the act of image making and then space production, and how maybe in of itself are we ultimately just realizing these spaces don't work compared to how they're then manifest themselves in individual culture. And do you think, in your mind, is there potentially a point by which maybe there is design has the power to actually mirror how they're created in these fantastical forms? Have we just not reached that point yet? Or maybe is it impossible to reach these forms? We're just sort of being sold dreams and towing the party line, proverbially. Thank you very much for that. And Min, having read your presentation yesterday, I enjoyed a lot more you reading it in person. Even the act of you coming in with your archive, the whole sequence, and then your dog maybe being part of the archive. I don't know. And I really enjoyed that. And I think the way in which you narrated your work was quite poetic, it was quite beautiful, and you weren't reading the words verbatim, you were just picking elements of that, and I think it was very powerful. What I would have liked actually, I think beforehand, was of you to define tangibly or visually the difference between like collecting objects and hoarding. What is the point by which you become a collector, you become a hoarder? Does it have a spatial relation? Is it visual? I've seen documentaries in the past of hoarders, and there are definitely levels to hoarding, I would say. But no, I did really much appreciate that. Zekun, with the portfolioism, actually, I really enjoyed the passion by which you actually just communicated the project. I could actually feel you had a strong belief of what you were discussing. I think it's very healthy to not only just criticize others, but criticize yourself and also the profession you find yourself within. And I think it definitely opens the question to a lot of things that we know subconsciously that we're maybe not comfortable to speak out loud. I'm quite curious to know, in sort of revealing these truths, has it sort of affected the way by which you yourself create your own work? Are you conscious of this, that maybe what I'm creating as an architect, as a designer, as a student, is it fitting in line with everybody else? And in the act to make something that's more fitting with your own idiosyncrasies, does that make it more difficult? And also, how do you feel maybe we could change things to improve the architectural marketplace, not only for students, but also the teaching element of it as well? Thanks.
Are we doing a sort of quick fire round, or are people being given a chance to respond, or how?
You can respond. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Is this one working? No, I don't think this one's. Sorry, I'll be really quick. Yeah, I think, thank you for your comments, but going back to the documents that you were talking about, I think that was a part of my research as well, which I didn't necessarily include in the specific essay, but there are like legal documents that they have to put in place for these temporary festivals, and I think this topic just generally of ephemeral architecture has become slowly a passion of mine, and it's developed into my Diploma 7 design project here as well, where it's also called the liminal state, but it looks at more kind of advocating for the river itself and kind of building in between the liminal terrains that it has, and kind of within looking at the rituals and creating these stages. So yeah, that is something that I'm putting into my design project.
Hi, hello. I don't know if I understood your question correctly, but I understood it as whether, like, as a simple question, can we reach high rise of homes, and was James Wines or Rem Koolhaas selling us a false promise? I think for the sake of this essay, because my course was also just about drawing and interpretations, and I look on things, I kind of emphasize misreading, but I don't think, I very much believe that there was something really strong about James Wines' series of drawings. Even if they're not realized into tangible solutions, there is already at play a conflict about the countryside and the city. And I think rereading this generations and generations, I think it helps us to develop a more nuanced stance about the city and vice versa. So yeah, I don't think we were sold false promises, but I think misreading is just very fun to do. Yeah.
Thank you for the questions and the comments. I think regarding how the writing on portfolioism affects my own work, it's actually the other way around, because I made some of these thoughts back in 2019 when I was myself an applicant to graduate schools. And I felt that, I think probably all of you who came to the AA as well, there was a process of putting together of your work that was in the studio to a booklet, and it's very different. And I just noticed about these the media presence of online portfolios, and I know it's also a biased sample, but it's also precisely this biased sample that the way portfolioism becomes an ism. It functions because it sort of pollutes the rest of the architecture intelligentsia, of everyone who looks at these things for reference. And with regard to the demographics, I also mentioned in the essay that in today's architectural education context, a lot of students come from Asia, different parts of Asia, coming to the UK and the US and Europe. And it just reminds me of how Rem Koolhaas was giving, back in 2004, a lecture about preservation, and he mentioned that after the 1970s, as Europe stopped urbanizing and they also stopped producing manifestos, and it was at that time when Asia started urbanizing rapidly. And yeah, I think this sort of discussion about portfolioism has to just also fall into this context and dynamism.
Well, firstly, I must say I always think I'm not a good writer. That's why I pick a kind of different submission type. But in response to the question of different levels of hoarding, I do think I kind of am someone who doesn't have a boundary for hoarding. Although through this exercise of firstly understanding that all of these stuff that I collect is a kind of extension of myself, and through actually doing the exercise, it have actually helped me to kind of feel a little bit better of having too much stuff. And if anything, I must also say that Dariya also said that it's almost kind of impossible to be able to record the history, because it would always be something that is false. So yes, as much as I say that I'm trying to be objective here, I am certain that my archive will be subjective, but it helped. And that, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I've been trying to imagine how your whole life is going to fit into this archive, and how actually, it seems quite small, and I'm sort of desperate to look into it. On the question of portfolioism, I think what Ed said about the detail was really interesting. And I found myself wondering the other way, which is, did you consider, were you tempted to look at what other options would be, like what the sort of cures might be, or ways of actually, thinking about alternatives? Because I find that actually incredibly interesting to know. You talked about pollution of the profession, and I'm thinking, well, maybe, it'd be quite interesting. What do you think could purify it? Which goes in a way to the liminal state, and this personhood of rivers is such an important moment in that purification. We've done terrible things to our rivers, terrible things in this country. We're still doing it. We pour out tons and tons and tons of sewage, raw sewage, into our rivers every day. And I found, I really enjoyed your presentation. I really enjoyed the variety. I enjoyed the actors. I enjoyed the way that, things were passed down from generation to generation, even although it was something temporary, that it traveled. And then when I got to the end, and suddenly, you talked about ritual and habit, and then suddenly there were these big sort of petrol-driven machines remaking this this edge of the river, and I thought, was that a habit? You know, why did you draw those machines? How would the river, the goddess, feel about those machines? And then, I'm not sure I can really ask the question, because you said that you didn't believe that we were being sold full streams, and that it was more, misreading. But I think, for me, I kept thinking about whether you'd been tempted to look at CGI, and also, one of the things that I find so disconcerting about building sites is when they put up ivy, painted ivy or plastic ivy, and then it goes away when the building's finished. And I can never quite understand the purpose of that in the first place, because it's sort of neither one thing or another. I don't know if we want to move on and then have responses in a group. Would that be?
Kind of picking up on two things there, really. I think, first of all, congratulations for really interesting topics. We're sort of coming back to you and saying, we want to know more, we want it to be pushed further. I think also, when you're thinking about writing a piece, you've got to think about the zooming in and zooming out. So it's the detail that will qualify and support your arguments in each place. So if you're providing a statement, you've got to back it up with detail. But detail is also very useful for a narrative point of view, for an anecdotal point of view. It can engage you and it can draw you in. You only have to look at sort of more popular writers like someone like Malcolm Gladwell, who engages and hooks you with detail. But then you've got to think about, where do you want to get with your conclusion? You've identified these really fascinating areas. I think the portfolioism, for instance, we're saying, who's the demographic? We want to know the economics behind it. What's driving it in terms of economics, but also what is it doing to architecture? Is there a kind of genre? Are there things that you can identify about those types of portfolios as characteristics, for instance? So you want to just take it further and think, where are you going to end up in your conclusions for all these things? So yeah, zooming in and zooming out in scales, but all fascinating topics. We just want more of it, really.
Hey, all right, I'm gonna try to keep it nice and short and sweet, because I know that I tend to talk too much, so just shut me up if needed. Wow, what a range. Okay, so there's something in common, though, I think, and maybe it's just because the first talk set the tone for me to the rest in a way. I think there's a certain subject. I'm going to argue right now that subject is the trickster. Okay, so what's the trickster and how do you relate it? How can I maybe just quickly say something very quickly about all four? Which is, so you talk about the ritual process, right? I think you're invoking Victor Turner, the anthropologist, who talks about liminality as a ritual. So in between, the ritual is what? In between two moments of structure, someone goes through transition, there's a moment of anti-structure. In that moment, you're profoundly vulnerable, right, to being hacked. That's where the trickster shows up and starts to manipulate the story. So when I kept on reading yours, I was wondering, who is the trickster? And I was wondering, maybe the children are the tricksters who bring the story forward and change it slowly, right? So this kind of productive trickster. I really, really enjoyed the narrative process, and it really made me think about the trickster as a positive role. Now, how can maybe we use the trickster to understand the other three? In yours, I kept on thinking about how amazing it is to study misreadings. I really enjoyed how thorough the essay was, and the comparative kind of diachronic framework. Now, is the misreader a trickster? Are they hacking the project in a moment of, let's say, stylistic anti-structure to make it their own? Rem Koolhaas is stealing that drawing, right? In his own way. So is Wines. I mean, in a better way, I think. But then how are you, right? The provocation for me is, are we in a moment of stylistic anti-structure? The next essays would suggest so. So thank you for raising that question. Min, okay, have you ever read that Borges story about these Jesuits, colonizers? They go to somewhere in an Latin American island, and they commission a one-to-one map of the island. So someone tries to make this map that's one-to-one of the island. It just covers the whole island, and it just disappears and vanishes. Okay, so trying to document everything results in a kind of nihilistic enterprise, right, where everything and nothing exists at once. So, in this story, I would suggest you are the trickster, trying to convince us that hoarding and collecting are the same. But I will not be tricked in this moment of anti-structure. Editing matters, right? So the collector edits. What defines the collector is the criteria and the values that allow one to choose and one not to choose. So it does not become a nihilistic enterprise. It becomes an enterprise of posterity, of memory, right? So I wonder how editing could benefit your work, right? Or if this is the provocation about editing itself. Maybe this is the intent. But I think we must remember that editing matters. Lastly, Zekun. What a profound, trenchant critique of our discipline. I do admissions, and I will do them differently now, I think. I mean, I've always thought this. I think we've always all thought this. No, I thought your essay was fantastic. I thought you weaved primary sources found on the internet with theory and with institutional critique beautifully. Who is the trickster here? I don't know, perhaps us, right? Perhaps us educators and admitters are the tricksters who allow this to happen, who maybe allow the discipline to descend to such a place where you make more money teaching people how to copy portfolios than being an architect. The moment of anti-structure here is the discipline itself, right? So I think in your essay you've truly finally done a postmodern understanding of architecture in the true sense, in the sense of Frederick Jameson, which is not just about the image, but it's about capital, about a critical relationship between institutions, capital, and the image. So I think it was a fantastic piece of work.
Yes.
Sorry. Just quickly from the audience, thank you very much for your presentations. I think something just kept coming into my mind as you were presenting, and I thought I'm just going to quickly say this. What is your writing in the service of? And this isn't something that I expect anybody to answer, but I suppose, Min, my heart broke a little bit when you said, I'm not a good writer, so that's why I chose a course that has another submission. Which actually, I found that really actually quite funny, because I suppose the kind of joy of today and the reason that I asked the question, what is your writing in the service of, is because I think the act of writing is an act of construction. It is within itself an act of design. And I suppose, I think, keeping that in the back of your mind and thinking, does something need to come out of it? Does a design project need to come out of it? Does an archive need to come out of it? Or do you simply archive by putting down the words of the things? So I suppose it isn't a question, but I think I think there's kind of varieties of engagements with writing that we've seen, particularly in this last group. And there were moments where I really did feel that the words were there because the words matter. And other moments where I felt the words are actually trying to get somewhere. And actually, do words need to try? In a world of, where designers, where architects, there's the kind of ambition of eventually being concrete, in inverted commas. And there's a beauty, I think, in the word being the most concrete thing. So I just wanted to put that out there. It's not really a question, and I really, really enjoyed very much your work.
Would you like to respond to any of the comments or questions?
Anyone wants to start first? You can start first. Thank you very much. I thought of the way that I was trying to turn my essay into a something was because the way I feel like I think is very fragmented, and it's not really a very there's not a linear thread to it. And so to answer the question of how can I squeeze my life into this box is I find that this exercise has helped me to redefine maybe two things. Firstly, the words that I put in them. And so usually when we want to understand a word, we need other words to explain it. And of course, that there is some sort of a definition to those words. Whereas when I put these words down into these boxes, where they will remain for a long time, somehow these words may have different definition to me or to people who would look into them. And at the same time, it's also helped redefine the way I collect things. So I imagine that in this box, of course, it can hardly be everything that I have. I hope it will be, but in here, it's kind of, so far the system that I have been trying to use is actually, I put them into a collection of my own kind of category, and then in a way, they firstly, they help me to organize my stuff physically at home and kind of keeps stuff organized in my head. And also, when I did that, I put it in that drawer. I can then, it allows me to then forget about it. I kind of exteriorized my internal thing into the word. So that's what I thought. At the same time, thank you.
Zekun, how would you do admissions in this day and age? Supply the knowledge. Quickly.
Yeah, and quickly to answer that, the way it is today, because admissions is only part of the larger system, and it's logical that it is what it is today. Okay.
Nothing like a live charrette on
Yeah, there. I think things like admission offices are also picking up this tendency. I know University of Hong Kong and Chinese University of Hong Kong, there are some professors who brought it up, and then they basically question the originality of the student work, and that is definitely a valid questioning. But in my own experience in actually teaching in one of these institutions part-time, the reality is that we're more helpful. It's like students are very helpful to students, and I see that as something else. It's not just regarding to architecture education, but also the discipline of architecture itself. Like the kind of expectation of the drawings that we produce can be met by some students who just produce those, and sometimes they find it more helpful than the advice from their professors. Especially adding to the demographic factor, in different parts of the world, architecture is taught very differently. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I'll be quick as well, but going to your question when you were talking about the last drawing with the machines and the goddess, which I think, as I wrote the essay, I realized it became one of the most important aspects, the dismantling of the entire scene as well. Because as you can construct it as well, you dismantle it and you see kind of what the scars, let's say, what's left to the terrain. And actually, my research actually began from there, because there's a lot of sand mining that occurs along the rivers. So I kind of look at the river, this duality, kind of at the sacredness of the river, but the river itself has rights of a legal person as well in India now. So there's this, these two lenses that you look at the river through. So I think it's important to look at it through the machinery as well, because that's a very tangible and something that is happening, to really see kind of how the dismantling happens. And just going to what you were saying, I think I really liked your comment about the zooming in and the zooming out to kind of give yourself perspective as well as you write. And yeah, no, that was a really nice, interesting comment. And just finally, you were talking about the trickster in a positive role, and I think that's a very nice idea, because when you talk about the children and this kind of transgenerational kind of aspect of it, I think there's this very clear agency of care that kind of comes through. This kind of trying to maintain this memory of the festival, of the people, and it kind of lives only within the minds of the people, and there's this temporary aspect to it, which I think the temporary aspect of it allows people to carry it on transgenerational, you know. Like I said in my essay as well, in a quote from the architect Raoul Mokhtar saying, we're not forever, so why should our institutions be? So maybe there is this aspect that if it is temporary, if it is, then it becomes more overpowering, and it's something that's important that can be passed on. But thank you.
Hi, I've been wrecking my head trying to kind of answer the question, and I think they're all really important. I think your comment about CGI rendering and all these kind of plasticity of Ivy, I think you're commenting on this kind of a trend in visual culture, and also that afflicts architecture as well. And you also mentioned about scale and Trickster and being kind of like being meta aware of what we produce. I think beyond more kind of pessimistic questions about real estate market and other stuff, I just was thinking, and also looking at other people's work, I was just thinking, why am I actually analyzing Rem Koolhaas and James Wines, who's been analyzed like to death? Like maybe I should actually look at the real estate brochures and really try to read what the visual, what their language is and what their mechanism. And so maybe this is much of I'm trying to embrace all these questions. So maybe when I'm if a misreader is a trickster, maybe we should not only look at the architectural canon, we should be able to demystify the canon, but also to look at what else could be a canon of architecture. And I think there could be a more democratic approach to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think actually it's really fascinating to hear sort of all the responses, because I think a lot of what you're talking about, everyone is talking about, is consequence. And there's consequences to many of sort of the misreadings that you're talking about in Wines and Koolhaas, and how they've manifested themselves in sort of development and et cetera in the high rise. Likewise, the consequence of our constant thirst of individuality and originality, and sort of, you know, my teaching partner David Green says originality doesn't exist anymore, but we still search for it. And the portfolio is kind of a culmination of that in trying to present ourselves as original. I mean, I think in both cases you're both unpacking something that's really much more important underneath than on the surface of the portfolio, and sort of a critique of the discipline and where we're going. And I think I would look at that level on the next stage. Because we all ask about pluralism and everything, and it's very important to us. But what are the consequences of that? And so, yeah, I think we all need to think about that. And I think hoarding. I keep thinking everyone wants you to use words for the objects you're hoarding, but you said you categorize them, and I'm actually interested in the words that would be between the categories. Because when you hoard something, right, spatially, like there's still a system, right? Ed has a system for archiving, right, by years, right, and it's super organized, right? And hoarder is typically not so organized, right? But there is an organization, and the words in between could give a clue about what that might be. And so I would maybe there's other boxes about those connections, right? But I think we should move on to the next group. But thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you. So we'll start round three with three more presentations, starting off with Lior, then Sonia, and then Mark. Lior, table's yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Perfect. So, Mirror is a thesis on the ambiguous character of social housing in the context of a national and territorial conflict. It is a story about clashing narratives and agencies in the process of national emancipation. The protagonist of the paper is Rawabi, the first planned city of modern Palestine. First inhabited in 2015 and still under development, the city was originally established as a part of a national affordable housing scheme for the Palestinian new middle class through a public-private partnership between the Palestinian Authority and the entrepreneur Bashar Masri. Since the early 2000s, the Palestinian Authority promotes the implementation of a neoliberal economy, believing the investment and stability could set the foundations to a sovereign state. And Rawabi follows precisely that notion. The architecture and self-image of the city fosters a global ethos of the urban middle class that entails the elaboration of modern and Western concepts of domesticity. It is designed as a uniform compound organized around a commercial center, orbited by 22 neighborhoods of apartment buildings, all similar in style. Rawabi is aiming to be an oasis of normality in the West Bank, foster neoliberal values through an image of comfort, consumerism, and abundance. Yet, Rawabi's political identity is ambiguous and contradictory. Starting with its policy, Rawabi is not philanthropic enterprise per se, but it is not meant to be profitable, and it is heavily reliant on Qatari and American foundations and NGOs. But then the choice to invest in housing solutions specifically for the middle class is puzzling, especially given the difficult conditions of the weaker sections of the Palestinian society. The social notion of affordability seems to be missing. So Rawabi's mechanism of affordability simply works to expand the rates of availability for housing, but does so only to those coming in line down the socioeconomic ladder. Namely, affordability is only for those who can afford it. Moving forward, an analysis of Rawabi's architecture unveils interesting parallels with Israeli social housing. For example, like in the modernist Israeli complexes of the 50s, Rawabi's spatial and architectural uniformity is mobilized as a national and educational device designed to introduce and frame a so-called Western progressive mode of living, as opposed to a supposedly Oriental, chaotic, backward forms of urbanity. Parallels can also be drawn in a more formalistic level. For example, the Jerusalem stone cladding used over the expansion of Jewish Jerusalem that forges the architecture to a narrative of ancestral right through a sense of history and spirituality. Or in other example, the common Zionist concentric citadel-like urban planning seated on the hilltop for the territorial security objectives. So is Rawabi reappropriating Israeli architecture and strategy for Palestinian goals? Perhaps, but one can also offer an alternative narrative. Rawabi's uniformity could stem from the denial of the chaotic Palestinian urbanity as an identity, since it is a negative consequence of the occupation more than it is a choice. The Jerusalem stone quarrying is simply a central branch of the Palestinian economy, and in fact, Rawabi has an on-site quarry incorporated inside to reduce the construction costs. And even the concentric planning is simply the cheapest and most rational technical solution for laying infrastructure and services in a hilly topography. Thus, by virtue of the complex political reality, architecture in Israel-Palestine is interwoven with a subjective narrative. It can be read simultaneously as a national symbol or cultural appropriation, a territorial strategy, or merely economic pragmatism. Rawabi's architectural ambiguity may elude criticism as an object or policy, but what about as a nation-building strategy? So Fayyadism, nation-building ideology that Rawabi follows, is working to detach the economy from politics and administration to establish the foundations for a neoliberal state. And a critique of that raises a new dilemma. On the one hand, neoliberalism in the context of colonialism has the power to tame conflicts. It replaces the discourse of human rights with the individual aspiration. Strengthening the middle class enables political stability that denies a culture of rebellion and austerity, notions that are carried out by the lower social classes of the refugee camps and the rural villages. But on the other hand, can the Palestinian move forward from these traditional values of austerity? After decades of occupation, the Palestinian people and the middle class within it have the right to self-improve and strive for a better lifestyle. Rawabi perhaps offers a new mode of resistance that defies the occupiers' monopoly on modernity and progress. Either way, the Palestinian Authority, likewise the Israeli ones in the 50s, is creating categories of social status enforced by the differentiated housing typologies and policies. And that brings us to the conclusion. It seems that when social housing projects are framed under a national territorial objective, and no matter the architecture or the specific nation or the political affiliation, the human right to decent housing becomes secondary. Such housing projects fulfill their strategic role, but with a collateral damage, which is the price of a social rift. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sonia, and the title of my essay is To Present the Past in the Present. I will start with the postscriptum. The intent of the essay was to remove the notion of images in which the builder atlas was built upon. The intent of this piece of work is to remove content away from context. The intent of this piece of work is to be read in relation to the methods of how Aby Warburg presented. For those of you who are well informed about Aby Warburg's Builder Atlas and the richness of history it beholds, I invite you to detach yourself from the historical analysis of his work and to focus on the now. For those of you who are less informed about Warburg's Builder Atlas, I invite you to attach yourself to his demonstration of the then. The format of the triptych was an attempt to move beyond the comparison of the two and towards the association of the many. It contains history as Warburg did and creates borders to distance ourselves from the origins of these artifacts. It was an attempt to invite us to the present and allow for rearrangement. He used words which can purposefully be misunderstood. He used emotion which provokes the suddenness of the present. I will use a mixture of words and images to attempt to engage the present. And lastly, he was longing for totality which left his work unaccidentally incomplete, or rather ever transforming. Words should be spoken from the very beginning because order matters in this sense. His decision to verbalize words rather than inscribe his thoughts ensured that his creation was always located within the present moment rather than frozen like the historical artifacts he was ironically demonstrating. I tried to emphasize his intent of using communicative memory to provoke cultural memory which is embedded. Words were a form of communication, but it was also a possibility for misunderstanding. It provokes an instant reaction. Warburg could not control these reactions with his words but could only guide it. He was fiddling with the idea of controlling the possibility of insufficiency through choosing to verbalize his work, similar to that of this presentation. If words are seen as his panels and letters are seen as the images he curates, then an anagram presents itself. The constant rearrangement of the panels formalizes their reactions and thoughts through the possibility of sufficiency and insufficiency, or more eloquently translated, through the possibility of possibility. We end the first chapter with beginning. Title. The use of the word atlas exemplifies Warburg's playful nature with words. He used the structure of cartography as a tool to present information spanning time and space. In essence, Warburg chose to use words to humble our perspective from that of a godlike, fully formed view to a view of the unformed and incomplete. I borrowed this unformed perspective and attempted to frame certain letters in brackets, which in turn left multiple readings of the same sentence. A view of the formed and incomplete, the unformed and complete, the unformed and incomplete, and so on. This was a method carried on throughout the essay, notably in the essay's title as well. With words, we are orientated towards emotion. Maybe this is how Warburg intended his library to be read. Although not touched upon in the essay, Warburg's method of categorizing the floors in his library begins with the image, then words, then orientation, and finally action. Through the lens of the essay, the chapter emotion should be rearranged to the first one because images provoke emotion, as Warburg discussed. Warburg's made-up word pathos formula is explained through a series of anecdotes in the essay. What Warburg wanted to demonstrate with the concept of the pathos formula was the result of a transformation, something that is individual and refers to a specific event, pathos, becoming something generic and permanent, formula. He saw these effects as being formalized historically in objects of art. Through his careful curation, Warburg was able to achieve the presence of temporal emotion through history. He demonstrated temporality and historicity at the same time. He provoked present thoughts about the past through emotion. The intent with the final chapter was to trigger memories of those that have known and then have left. It is the want to complete a form permanently, yet remain incomplete eternally as well. It is Mnemosyne in her core. We are attached to these panels and its contents because we are constantly reminded of them. It is not through our memory of them. Longing enters us in the realm of possibilities that Warburg introduces through an encompassment of words said and emotions felt. Through his unfinished panels, the concept of totality as we know it is questioned. The rigidness of a full form becomes fragmented with the reduction in numbers. Through a fragmented portrayal and a collapse of time, the idea of rearranging, reorganizing, recollecting, a sequence, a series, creates a lineage to be passed on, a linear arrangement of thoughts. It is something being presented in the present and is ever in transfiguration. In the words of Mark Cousins in The Ugly, a moment in the unfolding of a beauty whose form as a totality is all, the more triumphant for having overcome the resistance to itself in its moment of ugliness. The misunderstandings, thought-provoking arrangements, and unformed nature of Warburg was not a method to approach totality. It was a demonstrative way to overcome the resistance of totality in its whole presence. Thank you very much.
Sonia, and we'll conclude with Mark.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Mark. You can call me Tzu-shuo Wu. My essay titles Right to the Square, the Display of Power Relation on Tiananmen Square. So numerous theses have identified the polar powers exerted by the governor and that of being governed, and thus accentuated their antinomy. These discussions have been imbued into architectural design by deliberate manipulation and inventions of some architectural prototypes. Among them are squares. In this essay, I discuss the role of public squares in China, taking Tiananmen Square, the locus of Chinese communist regime, as the example. Instead of abruptly frame the square as totalitarian archetype or democratic civic space, I investigate the struggle between two powers, admitting the domineering power of the state, yet opening up to the potential of civil reclamations. These two contradictory yet coexisting powers could be summarized by the concept of near order and far order raised by Henry Lefebvre. The far order in this case is the state institutional power. The two forces are in constant mediations, and the apparent expression of the later is civil disobedience. Nonetheless, we must admit that even though the potential for civil disobedience is never denied, the far order has been the constant dominant power in Tiananmen Square. Physical manifestations of political superiority can be demonstrated through two major ways. First, through selective inclusion and exclusion of body behaviors, and second, through architectural coercions. First, let's talk about the parades. These bodies are not necessarily ready-made and collected. They are often fashioned and assembled for a display. Although still a representation, such a display has less to do with describing and depicting the phenomenal world. Its challenge is instead to turn political ideologies inside out, revealing the objectives of a regime. Therefore, bodies were exploited as the direct instrument to convey political agenda through visual symbols and abstract notions. The presence of anonymous and uniform bodies does not only show national cohesion, but the political loyalty and the ideological convergence through synchronized actions and performances. To articulate what has been displayed in Tiananmen Square were not aesthetic artworks, as you can see here, but the people, the bodies, and anonymous masses accredited by the country's ideological framework as the source of power and the constructor of the nation's glorious future. Among all the architectures that surrounds the Tiananmen Square, two monumental buildings deserve extensive emphasis: the monument to the people's hero and the Mao's portrait. Figures on the monument reliefs are non-identifiable to any specific individual. It's the anonymity, this absence of individuality, has created an empathetical illusion that whoever visited this relief could be the hero, stimulating the déjà vu to relate oneself with the revolutionary history, and thus remind the people that themselves are still undergoing a huge revolution. While the placement of Mao's portrait on the Tiananmen not only determined his irreplaceable political status, but is also conveying Mao's political message through his eternal gaze. As people parading and occupying the Tiananmen Square are practically impossible to see Mao's on the tribune of Tiananmen, the portrait has become the substitute for them to receive Mao's review. People are uplifted by Mao's gaze to a new level of spirituality. Under this imaginary gaze, they are no longer a scattered individual, but has become an immense body, a body that had Mao as his head and brain, thus elevating Tiananmen and the square to a political monument, a center where people's heart and gaze converge and where Mao's ideologies and gaze radiates. Although the influence of political apparatus is omnipresent and dominant on Tiananmen Square, the near order did not reflect the far order transparently. Even the failure of the far order was temporal and transitory. We should not overlook this dynamic and potential. During the dawn of 20th of May, 1989, a 7-meter-high polystyrene foam statue, representing a young woman holding a torch with both hands were erected on the central axis of Tiananmen Square, symbolizing college students' anguish, their desire for freedom of speech, and their quest for democracy. It abruptly altered the square's political the space spatial structure and political significance. Presence of bodies were no longer an act of political subordination, but a scene of civil disobedience. Accompanied this counter-revolution in Beijing were uprising in more than 60 cities in China. Interestingly, majority of them was realized through illegal occupation of squares in city centers. It is precisely because of the square's proximity to political centers and their convergence of political symbols, bodies, and ideologies that they have bred the most suitable hotbed for political uprisings and civil disobediences. As David Harvey argued, I want to conclude with this, the right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. The freedom to make and remake our city and ourselves is, what I want to argue, one of the most precious and most neglected of our human rights. As a conscious citizen, we should always keep in mind our right to manipulate and to reclaim the ground. Although it might be fantastic to change the status quo of Tiananmen Square, yet the riots on this most ideologically charged space had inspired active reclamations of rights on squares in other Chinese cities. It is not only a retrospect to the square's initial prototype, but a re-examination of the most basic rights that all Chinese citizens bestowed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you everyone for your presentations. Again, extremely thought-provoking, very rich aspects of research, using typologies, architectural kind of projects as a means to unpack socio-political issues around the world. I think is really nice to see. It's been consistent throughout the day, and also, Sonia, yours sort of unpacking the way we design, the way we think about presenting material, the way we look at things, sort of rethinking the discipline also has been a consistent theme. So it's really nice to see those two kind of being at the core of what we're talking about today, and how history and theory is sort of exploring those aspects. So with that, I'll pass it over to our critics. Who would like to go first? Nick, you want to start this one?
Thanks, guys. So very different. Two I put in my own head. I put in a kind of similar category you do, and then a slightly different effort, different project. So it's always interesting to be here and to try to reconcile the irreconcilable. Which is to say, also at the end of the day, the prize is also slightly subjective because it requires forming allegiance around a mode of expression, not necessarily the quality of that expression. So everyone's a winner. Yay, trophies. But what do I want to say? Okay, so Lior, is that correct pronunciation? Lior. Thank you. So very, very, very thoughtful research, clean prose, properly academic piece of work. I'm very impressed that you got Masri on the phone, the developer. You interviewed him? Yes, I did. Yeah, the developer, kind of billionaire. Curious to know more about how you got the Palestinian developer billionaire on the phone. But that's cool. I mean, that's really impressive. As a kind of qualitative field worker, I admire that ability to do that, however you did. But just to, again, quickly, Nick. To summarize, okay, I think the two of you, in a way, what's happening is something similar, right? And I'll say a couple more things about yours later, but is that you're ending where maybe you should start, and which means to me this is just a project that should be continued, right? So in your case, what really struck me was on page 18, you say, the purpose of this paper is an attempt to expose Rawabi's political ambiguity. I wish you'd said that on page 1. Because then I think the huge opportunity there is to understand the win-win discourse as the very, very kind of fluid, as the very mechanism through which ambiguity is perpetuated in a highly lose-lose kind of scenario, right? So there's something really powerful there. And I wrote, should do a PhD, but maybe not, I don't know. Similar with yours, I mean, it's about the bodies and the annihilation of bodies into a spectacle, as the square and the body become inseparable, they're symbolic apparati, just as the square is I wonder what would have happened if you'd started there and then maybe been able to say, how is this happening in particularly Chinese way of a cultural revolution that's distinct from other socialist experiments and manifestations, right? So there's a question of particularity, which I think is particularly important to go on to next. And then finally, Sharifah, Sonia or Sharifah? Sonia. A fascinating kind of Warburgian adventure where you actually do what you say. The ends become the means. It's truly prefigurative. I kept on thinking of a book called The Chimera Principle by Carlos Severi, who starts with Aby Warburg to show that these memory devices are also basically constitutive of the fundamental principles of how we imagine, so not only remember. And in that sense, I kept on admiring your ability to make us inhabit Warburg's project, but wondering if you could have gone even further and created your own chimera by hacking it and adding in your own images or your own narratives cryptically, right, without telling us somehow. And then we'd have to sort of slowly realize that you've actually hacked the process, right, and added your own layer of imagination into that memory device, right? But very, very exciting. Enjoyed it very much. Thanks.
I'm going to be very quick. Again, good topics, great range, and strong treatments. And I'm more interested in the writing process than the treatment. But I think the one thing that stood out for me we got from you on the counter arguments. You threaded through the counter arguments before you came to the conclusion, and that's one of the only places I've seen it, and that was very strong. So that's my observation.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Very strong pieces of work, lovely to listen to as well as read. Actually, in both of your talk, Lior and Mark, I had a similar but dissimilar question, which was about, it started with people, and you talk about the neoliberal project, and that you can only afford it if you can afford it, and about how people aren't at the heart of the project, and yet in your writing in your project, we hardly see any people either. And so I'm sort of wondering about the relationship between the two of those and whether it was conscious or unconscious, because I would have sort of quite liked to know about the people. And then when we go to Tiananmen Square and we talk about bodies as a political tool in a way, and I just kept wondering and it exposes my lack of knowledge of what was there before, originally, actually, that ground. Places have a way of sort of reinforcing and often staying very similar despite what actually happens to them. Some places are always, well, you talked about it being close to places of political power, and I realized that I actually wanted a sort of, the prelude to your work to actually really just fill in those gaps in my own knowledge, because I found it a really beautiful piece of work otherwise. And I thought the comment about putting in your own stories, I was very struck by the point about images producing emotion. And I felt that I wanted to go, it was a beautiful piece, it was a beautiful set piece, it was beautifully presented, but I wanted more emotion from those images. I wanted to lose myself in them, and it just, I want to have that immediacy, and I wonder if there's a way that you could do that to make it more, just more visible. Are we? Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Comment on any of the observations?
Thank you for your comments. I think, as for your question, I think it's a bit tricky question to begin with, whether people are at the center of this project or not, because perhaps if you're reframing the question, whether you ask me whether making this a project for the people as a social. Some sort of social architecture in order to promote a very specific mode of living, which is the new middle class. So I suppose, obviously, this kind of ambiguous behavior of that piece of architecture as an object, as a policy, perhaps is not fulfilling, is not winning everything. It's perhaps because obviously there are still two modes of resistance that are very distinct social classes that are building up within that society, but it is very much culturally informed, or it has a very clear cultural, social objective. So that's for that question. And as for your question, how did I get to meet to speak with Bashar Masri? It was actually surprisingly easy, and I think again, it touches upon this precisely on this kind of ambiguity that on one hand, Rawabi is being instrumented or at least presented to the Israeli side as perhaps a table for discussion and for negotiation, both culturally and also economically. But at the same time, towards the Palestinian side, it's also very much presented as I would say maybe like first as a mode of resistance, but perhaps also like an outpost or a mechanism in order to defy and undermine the occupation. Obviously, perhaps through Israeli precedents of the citadel-like, the concentric planning, the morphology and the typology of the architecture. So him being very hospitable and also introducing me with his daughter that lives here in London was very much part of this, I think, maybe dual game. But also he was very generous, and I'm very thankful for him for speaking with me.
Yeah, thank you for all the Thank you for all the great comments. So I just want to respond to your question first. So in the previous dynasties in China, of course, the Tiananmen was also a very, very political space serving for the emperor. So it has been and always been a huge mode of behaviors. So but in every dynasty, they have different rituals and different process of meeting the emperors or meeting the governors. So you can view the Tiananmen Square as an approach to the heart of the palace. It is becoming a more and more sacred, and for every step you move in, you have a different ritual to take. You have a different modes of behavior to follow. So I think no matter in which dynasty, in which period of time, body has always been a representation of the loyalty and the imperial power, and also it is also a place where the top-down orders and bottom-up expression of loyalty is put to the most explicit manner in China. So I think it is a really interesting way to discuss how body behaviors are being manipulated and how this public space could be a huge mode of behaviors throughout 2,000 years history of China. So in response to your question, so why not I'm not putting body first and discussing the governors later. I think this is a very very complex way of governance, because in the Tiananmen Square we can both see the top-down but also the bottom-up expression of the people between the government. So I think in either way, the first will be will lead to the other. So I think it is a continuous and back and forth process of government responding to the disobedience or to the obedience of the body, and the body's response in accordance to the regulations and to the laws. So I think that's a really interesting dual kind of connection between the people and the governor.
Thank you for the comments. I respond to both sort of questions about the images. I think in the essay itself, I chose not to include any of the images because I didn't want to take away, because the content of the Builder Atlas is so much that if you start to speak about it, you can almost like write you can go on and on about it. So what I tried to do was negate that and focus on the context, on his method. And within the presentation, I was also debating whether or not to include images, but I thought it was quite important to allow people who were not so familiar with the atlas to understand Warburg's ability to sort of categorize and make new associations with his constant rearrangements. And the reason why I sort of kept with his own images was to really showcase how he was able to associate really different pieces of art through single moments, through their movement, whether it was categorized through their movement or other aspects. And I felt like if I added to that content, that it would almost take away from the methodology. But I do appreciate that. It was something I struggled with as well, whether or not to include like my own images to provoke emotion. It's still something that I'm debating about in my head, to be fair. Yeah.
Thank you all for your interesting presentations. First, Lior, I think there's a great sense of almost like succinctness by which you presented the project, which matched the sort of the professionalism by which this whole project is being executed, which is quite nice. Almost quite poetic in that sense. I think I'm quite in agreement with Catherine in terms of it would be good, it would be really interesting to have received like opinion of the other individuals involved. Whilst it's great to obviously speak to the billionaire who's driving this, also then sort of maybe those who are trying to build the project themselves, the builders, the displaced peoples, or what the locals themselves speak from different strata of society. Those of the middle class, do they want to go to this? Are there alternatives to living? Those are poor demographics. If they are displaced, where do they move? Those in the upper echelons of society, do they keep this in high regard, see it as a good economical project, or do they look down upon the kind of spaces they wouldn't necessarily be in? I would additionally say there's a student called Khalid who left the year with me. I think we've read some very good, which you can discuss this idea with. If you haven't already, I can put you in contact. Also, Sonia, I think I initially was wondering why you didn't include the images, but then when I searched online, I then realized I think you could have easily gone to the nth degree, just taken apart each image alone. So I do understand why you did. I was also wondering, did the idea, because I think you split up the project, well, the description of the Build Atlas into sort of the three sections, the words, emotion, and longing. So I was wondering if the triptych came before you selected the words, or did those words become that and then it became a triptych? And then also, if you were to add additional sections, what would the focus be on? If you had, let's say, another triptych, or 6 sections in total. And then Mark, I really I like the historical approach you did with it. You approached with the looking at Tiananmen Square. I think it's a good way of us realizing how a culture or a society can be understood through the square, and that's almost an allegory for how you can understand the whole very existence of the community within the cityscape. It would have been interesting to actually maybe, if there was a more like surgical analysis, to see sort of maybe in plan how the space is entered, its size, its boundaries, where it is in context to other places within the cityscape, how this operates in relation to other squares, so we can then contextualize how this space operates. And maybe if there are other ways in which squares operate to better capacity to encourage civil disobedience, as you say, or if there isn't a square, how do people then have some kind of informal protest? But yeah, thank you again.
Do you guys want to answer? There's quite a lot there. I don't know if you want to take, or should we?
I can go first. For me, the notion, so the sort of format of the triptych came from Warburg's methods as well. So he had 3 different versions of the Builder Atlas, the first version, penultimate version, and then the final version, which he never completed. So again, with him not completing it, again, it's like start, the middle that's not finished, and then the end. So the notion of the triptych was came quite quickly. And what I tried to also explain in the presentation was that it allows for the concept or the idea of associations. So if you just have 2, that's a comparison. But with the triptych, then you're starting to be able to make comparisons between them. That was the intent of it. And I think the categories words, emotion, and longing. Yeah, to add to that, I started to do more research about his library, and I thought orientation was a really nice one, because that sort of encompasses everything. So I feel like that would be something that I'd add to it.
There's 4, right? There's 4 in the library.
Action, exactly. So in that case, there's 4. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, thank you for the comment. And you just mentioned a very important concept that I haven't incorporated into this essay, but I did in my studio research. So it's the urban context. So it's how the Chinese government, especially after the 1979, that they have developed the urban strategy based on the location of the square. So how the square is the center of the city, and how other institutional buildings and other recreational buildings are being scattered in accordance with the political ideology. So I think that's kind of a very important one to discuss also. And you just mentioned like how people enter and how this kind of movements and are being scattered on the square. So I think it is a really important, interesting to discuss if we follow the timeline of the square, like how it's been developed throughout the different dynasty and finally to the modern China as it is now. So yeah, thank you very much for the comments.
Thank you very much for the comments. I think they were valuable, and I should definitely consider them. I think if to react, perhaps like in a larger scale, not necessarily to the point that you're making, I think the underlying, one of the, at least, the underlying questions that come across, that I tried at least to put forward through this essay, is perhaps touching upon these things of what is actually the right price that comes with emancipation, that comes with this kind of territorial goal, with nation building, and obviously, it's a big question whether progress must have a price. Whether what is that price? Is it actually all right that these kind of projects come through and they're actually quite exclusive, and what it actually means to make them more inclusive. So I think speaking with people and understanding the consequences, like bottom up, would definitely kind of enrich the argument.
Okay. Systematically, everybody's gone round and asked the questions that I wanted to ask. So I've been ticking off, but there's a little bit left. Lior, I thought, I mean, you write very, very well. The argument's extremely well developed, sophisticated argument. I just feel, on the technicality or the craft of writing, I mean, the interview that you got, I mean, I'll be putting that in the first paragraph. I mean, you want to highlight that. You really, you've got to be kind of strategic about how you entice the reader in. And I would say maybe another edit to go through the whole, the whole argument is beautifully put together and it's very eloquent. But is there another kind of, I think you can just push that tiny little bit further in terms of of being sexy or being enticing the reader in, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. It's a very, very minor thing, and yeah, it's hardly a criticism at all, because I think it's amazingly well written. Mark, again, all my questions have gone, but I think, I think, again, when you started the essay with talking about the square and the kind of tracing it back to Greece and the agora, and I just think, as you were saying, to give a little bit more context of what the square means historically in China. It's a very, very different concept, I imagine, than in the West. And you clearly, you were doing it just now, so it's that's the only kind of really minor thing. Yours, I'm afraid, is a pet subject of mine, so I think bear with me. I find it really interesting, and I think your essay is so self-contained. You've set it up so nicely and defined the parameters that I can't really, you've defined it, so I can't criticize it for anything that's not included in there, which is a very good kind of device. And I wouldn't want to, because it's great. But some things that interest me personally. I mean, there's a lot of memory devices. I mean, I wonder if you wanted to push the project further, look at Renaissance memory devices. Warburg would have been very, very aware of these, and they're all architecturally developed. They're all very spatial concepts. In the 1890s and right through the 20s, 30s, all the early library catalogue systems, the Dewey Decimal, the UDC, they're all being developed. They're all ideas about categorization. It's this kind of idea that you can categorize and you can universalize knowledge. So I think those are interesting to look at. At the same time, him and technology. I mean, we obviously know all about him in and slide projectors, projecting the images, and he's one of the early adopters of that in art history. But in architectural history as well, in the 1920s and 30s, there's a huge revolution, and slide libraries are popping up all across in most of the schools, and we've got one of the only existing ones still left in the UK here. Yeah, Magic Lantern slides, big kind of format. So his categorization, his way of moving between images and creating narrative really influences how the architectural canon is formulated, and all these kind of... So I think it's a huge area ripe for research and just fascinating. So sorry, I've kind of gone off on my own thing, but it's a really, really, really interesting essay and extremely well put together. So thank you.
I just wanted to add a point, which is sort of a follow-up to Ed's, just around Warburg, and I think it's something that always, in a way, pertains to writing, which is to say, Warburg, there's an indiscernible line between what is logical and what is illogical. Of course, in his diary, he writes when he's incarcerated in a facility and undergoing treatment about how mystical butterflies would visit him at night, and he would speak to them, and they would explain to him the ways of the universe. And which is obviously a beautiful poetic image, but he then he doesn't translate anything. He then places into the image formulation of those panels a way of seeing the world that's entirely singular and abstract and unknowable. And I think there's a beauty of the unknowability of it, the lack of categorization. There's that wonderful Yale project where they go through and they discern all the images, the paintings, the clippings from newspapers, the pornography, etc., etc. And it becomes not about those images, nor really about searching for the symbols beyond them. It's the adjacencies between them, which is to say that they are always in motion. So there's a line of Warburgian scholarship that looks at him as a sort of proto-cinema, in a way, because the image itself is never fixed, the idea is never fixed. It always becomes about a composition that is always in motion until one is deceased, which is when, in effect, his archive becomes an archive.
Just conclude before we move on to the next group. I think what's really exciting is there's three sort of papers and investigations that are ongoing, as was mentioned before, and you're opening up windows to where that might go. And I agree. I mean, I think going to speak to people who live in the complex, but also to analyze its architectural kind of materiality, its construction, to understand kind of the economics behind that could really expand sort of the investigation. And I agree about the analysis of the square historically and also sort of politically, like what events have happened there over time through the different sort of political kind of leaders, etc., would really also kind of give it that more analytical approach. And you said something really interesting, Sonia, about comparison versus association, and the idea of multiplicity or multiples. And there's a lot of that in painting. Like Rauschenberg explored, like in Fictum 1 and Fictum 2, like that's about comparison between the two versus, let's say, Bacon and his triptychs, or sort of the different kind of photographic. I'm blanking again on. Becker, different kind of sort of those comparisons of setting up categories, et cetera, through typologies. And I think there's something within that as well that you can begin to explore further. But thank you very much. We all appreciate the provoking sort of presentations today. Thank you. So that concludes... So that concludes our diploma presentations and the essays from that, and now we'll shift to our theses, which is also diploma. But we have 4 students presenting that for the conclusion and the last group of the day. So if you can all come up, Thomas, Dariya, Tamara, and Masha. Thank you, Sonia. All right, so, sorry. Feedback there. We'll start with the 4th group. All these are thesis presentations, and we're going to start with Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so just before I start the presentation, I just want to recognize that the thesis is dealing with quite a severe subject, and so it may be triggering to certain people, so do feel free to leave the presentation if you feel it necessary. Thank you.
He would trap me in the kitchen or somewhere so I couldn't escape. And I knew I was going to get beaten up, and that was it. Every time he walked in the house, I used to shake. I don't know what's happened in an argument, and he got me into the corner of the kitchen and he grabbed a knife.
I know once he really, really shoved me in the kitchen, and the corner clink on the old cabinets went right into my back and cut all my back. But the home became in the way.
Domestic abuse and architecture have become entangled into the same conversation. Nevertheless, with no acknowledgement made between the correlation of architecture and domestic abuse, the current provision for the abuse survivor into long-term housing is inadequate. My thesis, titled The Art of Getting By from Domestic Abuse to Social Housing, uses first-person interviews with survivors to explore how the 2021 Domestic Abuse Act excludes the role of the architect and as a result removes the potential that architecture can offer for long-term recovery. The essay is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 addresses the absence of the architect in policy and uses personal conversations with survivors to reveal the significance of architecture in the process of abuse. And Part 2 becomes a testbed for an architecture of care by translating the research from Part 1 of the thesis into a design guide that situates the importance of the investigation into today's architectural practice. The presentation will engage with 4 key themes expressed within the thesis and how the role of architecture within domestic abuse cries out for a considered response. 1. The insufficiency of legislation for post-abuse housing. Author Jampal states, some women return again and again to their violent husbands, not as a result of some sort of sadomasochism, but as a consequence of inadequate help given. At the time of starting this thesis, the 2021 Domestic Abuse Act was given royal assent. Reacting to the staggeringly high statistics of post-COVID domestic abuse, the Act responds with a level of urgency for the survivor. Having only 50 years of contextual basis, this newborn policy introduces priority into existing social housing. However, the Act's definitions to terminology used and the lack of spatial criteria separates the architect from the conversation of abuse, and as a result does not consider the qualities of social housing and the harm that it can cause. 2. The correlation between architecture and domestic abuse. Interviews with survivors and experts within the field have revealed the role that architecture plays in abuse, and how the house is abused to become a weapon within the supposed place of sanctuary. Further, interviews have highlighted that after leaving the abuser, much of the post-abuse home is now littered with triggers of trauma, often acting as a catalyst for PTSD, anxiety, and isolation. Spatial patterns within interviews expose the implicit link that architecture has to inflict physical or psychological harm. Further, conversations have revealed that the role of architecture within abuse is not confined to the walls of the home. Instead, the neighbourhood and urban environment has the potential to play a significant role to help the escape of the survivor. Nevertheless, neighbourhoods are often designed to separate and insulate noise and interactivity, proving to delay the process of escape. The DAA's response to use social housing does not acknowledge the origins of the home. Designed initially to house working-class families with a very different criteria for comfortable living, the structure, layout, and materiality of social housing today configures a series of architectural fragments that trigger the survivor. These triggers extend the longevity of recovery and can result in the survivor returning back to the perpetrator of abuse. 3. An architecture of care. Despite social housing currently forming concern for the survivor, existing architectures of care show the possible impact architecture is able to have on recovery for both physical and psychological trauma. Acting as precedents to the thesis, these architectures enable the social house to undergo a much-needed perception shift. Therefore, part 1 of the thesis concludes with a rethinking to the context of social housing and how the long-term home is able to be redesigned to transition this surface-level safety response into a tool for recovery. 4. A remedial architecture as a test bed for practice. Part 2 of the thesis uses the preceding research to inform a design strategy for remedial architecture. Bringing the architect into the conversation, the guide proposes a methodology that can be applied at a national scale as a long-term option for the survivor. The guide shows that architecture as a response is related to and necessary for recovery. Designed as a series of retrofits to the current provision of social housing, the guide works to the parameters of the 2021 Domestic Abuse Act and the 2020 Permitted Development Rights. Part 2 is a testbed for bridging text, interviews, and policy to be synthesized together to form a strategy of architectural design implemented in practice, climatically developing a post-abuse architecture of care. The thesis ultimately has a sociological purpose, exposing the importance of architecture in domestic abuse. It is architecture that provides the stage set for domestic abuse. Furthermore, it is architecture that provides the tools of violence for abuse. It is architecture that gives the abuser the privacy and power to perpetrate their violence and that casts the characters of abuser, abused, and the peripheral reticent neighbour. Therefore, it is imperative to recognise the significant role of architecture within abuse and consequently the role it must play following such incidents to become an architectural antonym, transitioning the perception of the house from a place of violence into a home of refuge. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Masha?
Hi, my name is Masha, and the title of my thesis is The Yugoslav Dream, the Architecture and Economy of the Neighborhood Unit in Socialist Ljubljana. The paper follows the development of social housing in Slovenia, focusing on the period between the end of the Second World War and the country's independence from Yugoslavia in 1991. It looks into the changes in housing policy and their effects on the housing construction. The main reason why I became so interested in the topic is that Yugoslavian socialism was actually incredibly Western. It was a middle point between total collectivization and individualism, which reflected highly in the architecture that was being built. Although a socialist system, former Yugoslavia could not build solely non-market housing, mainly due to financial reasons, and therefore had to find different strategies to maintain its decommodified nature. This produced an interesting compromise between social and market housing, a hybrid model that still aimed to prioritize use value over market value, a compromise which unfortunately collapsed with Slovenia's transition to capitalism. During the Second World War, Slovene settlements were severely damaged, which only increased the pre-war housing shortage. Improving housing conditions and accommodation being accessible to everyone were the main priorities of Yugoslavia's social program. Since the post-war construction could not keep up with the growing needs, the state encouraged companies and institutions to start building housing for their workers. The first to respond was the company Litostroj in 1947, which built a typical functionalist settlement that still far exceeded living standards of the time. Soon, such settlements began to be criticized for their single-purpose nature and inability to form quality social communities. What came from this was a pioneering period of Slovene housing research. Architects, which had an enviable degree of autonomy, gathered ideas from European countries, especially Scandinavian, and paired with surveys and statistical processing of the Slovene existing settlements, they aimed to identify needs of residents and possible solutions. The living standard began to rise sharply. In 1958, Ravnikar's seminar at the Faculty of Architecture developed a design of an ideal neighborhood unit for 5,000 people. This model served as a blueprint for the first neighborhoods of Ljubljana, ensuring a quality living environment. This was a rounded residential area containing all necessary facilities for an autonomous social life. According to the neighborhood model, existing settlements received urban plans in an attempt to tackle the architectural heterogeneity and inconsistent quality of the built space. This can be observed well in the Sava settlement, which also became a testing ground for new housing typologies and design novelties, such as the 1962 high-rises with open floor plan apartments and sanitary shafts. Economic difficulties of the 60s prompted the introduction of two economic reforms, emphasizing greater enforcement of self-financing, ending a uniformly managed housing policy, and introducing the construction of housing for the market. This turning point was reflected in housing construction, when the first significant realizations of the neighborhood concept took place. Furthermore, architects began to reintroduce typical forms of traditional urbanism, specifically the street motif. In this first neighborhood unit, it is presented as a central dynamic element in the form of a footpath leading down the middle of the settlement, opening towards pockets of green public spaces. Built shortly after, the Ruski Tsar neighborhood, intended to establish a city within a city. Here, the dynamic element of the pedestrian street appears for the first time as the leading urban motive and the focal element of the neighborhood. In high-density housing construction, the street successfully creates space for pedestrians and facilitates spontaneous interactions of the local community. In the late 1970s, not far from Ruski Tsar, the neighborhood BS3 evolves the urban street into a form of a green street. The neighborhood is divided by alternating rows of urban and green arrangements, which facilitate a variety of social spaces, from children's playgrounds and recreation areas to walking paths and parks. Which brings us to the last and largest socially planned neighborhood, Fužine. With 4,500 apartments, it is the most densely populated area of the entire country. But despite its scale, the neighborhood is sensibly organized and characterized by articulated and diverse public spaces, parks, playgrounds, sports and recreational areas. And although bordering on market housing, it was still designed with clearly defined high-quality standards and prioritizing use value. The progress made in urban development during the times of Yugoslavia and the dedication to evolving key typological elements, ensuring a decent living standard and quality social life for the population, was outstanding and has not been present enough in the project since the country's independence. Despite its constitutional commitments, Slovenia has been without an effective housing policy since 1991, putting it at the top of European countries with the highest share of owner-occupied housing. Furthermore, the independence caused an extensive fragmentation of ownership and unclear relations regarding the neighborhood's public spaces, resulting in uncoordinated individual interventions disrespectful to the original architecture. Consequently, the coherence of entire neighborhoods collapses, transforming them into unrecognizable complexes with ruined identities. Socialist neighborhoods are a reminder that through large residential projects, we're not only building cities, but also the state, as they significantly impact social conditions, transport, and energy. Therefore, if the state abandons ambitiously planned construction, it abandons other areas of life, from economics to social and cultural. For that reason, it is crucial to embrace our socialist legacy build upon it, and ensure that the use value and community aspects of residential areas once again become the priority of the architectural and urban design. Thank you.
Thank you. Tamara?
Hi, my name is Tamara, and my thesis is titled Harvested, Transplanted, Adapted, the Settlement, Transition, and Resilience of the Bedouin Population in the Arabian Gulf. The nomad and the landscape is a relationship founded and built upon the earthbound philosophy adopted by all indigenous populations. Their respect and attachment to their context stems from all it has offered them, gifting them with food, intelligence, and life, and upon their death, taking them back. For the nomads of the desert, this relationship is no different. Learning from, growing with, and adapting to their landscapes, the nomads make the desert no less than they are made by it. This inherent adaptability, versatility, and flexibility of the tribe becomes the crux of this research, a characteristic that historically has framed the Bedouin as a backward entity, a source of trouble, obstructing state development, becomes their main reason for survival during their exploitation and introduction into the modern city. A series of actions performed and reciprocated, informing and transforming their changing, growing context. Structured into 3 sections, harvested, transplanted, adapted, this research aims to examine the role of social housing in the consolidation of a distinctly modern Arabia through the domestication and settling of the Bedouin. Focusing on state-subsidized housing schemes in the United Arab Emirates, how has this process of sedentarization and adaptation created a new national identity and form of living, which defines the urban fabric of the Arabian Gulf today? Before states, borders, and governments, the Arabian Peninsula and its harsh desert was home to many Bedouin tribes who, due to the scarcity of resources, adopted a self-reliant lifestyle. Their core values, which stemmed from Islam, such as reverence for leadership, hospitality, and loyalty, shaped all spheres of their life and defined their forms of living, their social structure, and their relationship with the state. The tent, the basic unit of the tribe, represented the extended family. Its light and temporal materiality, subdivided by curtains, differed from rooms in the modern house. Spaces appeared when needed and changed throughout the day. This versatility allowed the tent to become an autonomous and the household to become an independent entity, operating in line with the environment, attaching and detaching from the tribe as demanded by the landscape. In the case of the UAE, the tribe was very influential in the political structure of the country. Not only did they select the first president, Sheikh Syed, sitting in the middle, who himself was originally a Bedouin, but have also helped in creating a country whose political structure learns from its tribal past. An authoritarian, paternalistic local government centered around a ruling sheikh as the sole decision maker and the face of the country. Therefore, the sedentarization of the Bedouin was not only a way to deal with a fluid, uncontrollable, and backward entity beginning to strongly contrast the new modern lifestyle introduced by colonial powers and oil entities in the region, but was a way to secure a strong national identity, strengthen population numbers, and dilute territorial and tribal divisions to create a more homogeneous landscape among nationals who were and still are the minority of the population. This settlement materialized after the discovery of oil in the 1960s through the establishment of state-subsidized housing schemes by Sheikh Zayed called Sha'bi homes, which translates to traditional or folk, which offered Western forms of living with a link to a particular version of the past, modernizing the Bedouin lifestyle through their transplantation into homes that, with electricity and running water. However, a few months after moving into these homes, which were eagerly anticipated by the Bedouin, they were heavily criticized. Although they tried to accommodate the spatial practices and culture of the Bedouin, the offering of Western ways of living based on settlement imposed a lot of changes. Not only did the home change through its permanence and its defined plot size, but also its functional layout changed. Rooms were no longer flexible, fixed furniture was introduced, and the kitchen became a part of the home, leading to tensions between modernity and tradition. Despite the state's ambition to harvest, transplant, and adapt the nomad to Western and more civilized modes of living, the Bedouin could not be fully subjected to a way of life determined by someone else, even by the ruler of their own tribe. Following their nomadic instincts to learn from, grow with, and adapt to their context, they began to mobilize the space gifted and forced upon them, taking on the role of the designer, adding, removing, changing, and disconnecting spaces of the home. They shifted the role and power of architecture to construct and choreograph the movement back to the inhabitant, reversing the roles of the influencer and the influenced. As a result, rather than the government determining a new national identity and form of living for the nomad, it was them who, through their need to make their context work, defined and changed state policies and the shape of the urban fabric. Today, although the Sha'bi homes rarely exist within the urban fabric and are replaced by lavish villas and tall skyscrapers, its social values, spatial arrangement, and identity remain embedded within the current housing landscape. Residents, whether Emirati nationals or not, continue to live in and build homes and neighborhoods that follow the value and draw their spatial layout from the Sha'bi house. So the urban narrative of the Bedouin and the Sha'bi house is not a story of loss and subordination of the nomad to the powerful state, but tells a story of their resilience and influence on a condition imposed onto them, teaching a lesson on the dynamic adaptation of architecture and its role to define, transform, and shape the urban fabric. The actions and reactions were not only two-directional between the Bedouin and the state, but they were multifaceted. They were not limited to harvesting, transplanting, and adapting, but became a series of multiple operations, changes, and adjustments in which both entities learned and benefited from each other. Therefore, rather than the government or the Bedouin adapting to the other, they merged, resulting in a hybridized identity and urban form. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. And we'll conclude with Dariya.
Hello, my name is Dariya. The thesis Right to Rome would never exist without help from a community that call themselves Hiking Architecture. And most of them are here. And I'm very thankful to them. I was in charge of the hike for the first time 10 years ago. It was June 2012. I was then told, everything was great, you made everyone rest and enjoy, but why you never allow other people to help you? It's okay to get lost. It's even better to get lost while giving a chance to lead to someone who wants to learn, rather than returning home in time. Sean, a alumni, once said, asking people for help, you give them space and reason to reach out when they need a hand. To give a hand is the biggest honor. I walk through the hard times. I walk through losing the loved ones, through fighting with my own stubbornness, through a struggle to understand others, through a desire to fully love the world around, whatever it brings to us. I walk through very good times and patiently running through them. I write through the hard times. I write through the very good times too. I write to let go and to accept changes. I write to miss less. I write to feel less and to feel more. I still have 4 minutes left, and I want to invite you to experience the right that most of us have here in the room, but very little amount of people actually use it. The right to roam through Bedford Square. We're going for a 4 minutes hike. I would recommend to exit through this door. I have the key, probably will put me in trouble. And we'll meet here exactly 4.5 minutes in the same positions. Can you leave everything you have? And just imagine, let's just pretend that nothing has happened. Let's use the right we have.
Thank you. Thanks again for a good concluding group of presentations for the day. I think it's really nice to see some very serious, very challenging and difficult topics, very dense, I think, for us to digest. But then Dariya gave us that time and that space to digest it on a nice walk. So I'll pass it over to our guests.
Okay, now I've totally forgotten what I was going to say. Yeah. I mean, they're just great. Reading them all last night took me a long time. They're also well put together. So it's kind of rather random comments, I'm afraid. I'm hoping everybody else is going to ask different questions and you'll get a coherent set of questions at the end. But Thomas, I find yours is really, really engaging and sensitively written, put together. Strangely enough, it reminded me of Alice Coleman. I don't know if you know her book. I mean, it's rather kind of damning you by, you know, it's not a nice compliment to be called an Alice Coleman, I think. But she looked at this kind of architecture and criminality, wasn't it, and violence, and then used rather kind of questionable techniques to map on social housing estates which literally went around mapping where feces were, where vandalisms were, and then associating those with certain architectural features. So how architecture affects criminal behavior or antisocial behavior. And then this was she was brought in as an advisor to Maggie Thatcher's government and did some quite, shall we say, questionable effect. But her book, is it Architecture on Trial or Social Housing on Trial? But it's a very interesting book where she actually puts architecture literally on trial. And so the opening few chapters are kind of written as the defense, the prosecution. And then architecture comes with the defense, and then there's a conclusion. And of course she concludes that architecture is criminal and all these things need to be done. And it's a kind of mirror of what you're talking about in a way, isn't it? It's a kind of reverse. But I wonder if you can take something from her methods and improve them, and make. So it's really not a question; it's just a kind of rambling response at the end of a long day. But that's what it struck me. That kind of how you can. It's a very literal association of certain behaviours to certain architecture, and how far can you push that, and how can you respond to that, which I think is really interesting. Masha, I was thinking throughout. You give a very good and clear narrative, but I'm wondering if you had a bit more on the theoretical underpinning of what was the neighbourhood unit, what was the idea behind the neighbourhood unit, what kind of shape did it take? Does that kind of change as well? So it's just a bit of name dropping, or kind of the writers presumably who influenced the people who are doing these designs. Or if that's just a kind of assumption from English social housing, where you have a clear list of kind of names of people who kind of influenced. Yes, go ahead.
Hello. I mean, in a part of my essay, I did drop some names, but the fact was that I personally didn't even know this when I started researching, because Slovenia is such a small country and the architecture there is not that well known, around the world. So when starting to research socialism and socialist architecture, I came to the realization that, yes, we had this one, we can call him now a star architect, Plečnik, I don't know if anyone, and he, many of his students actually were students of Le Corbusier as well. So the reason why there's this self-justified confidence of the Slovene architecture of the time is because so many of the architects that now their names are slightly unknown, at least in this territory, they were actually students of very well-renowned architects. So they went abroad, which for a socialist country is an unconventional thing, that you can go abroad, you can learn from international architects, and then you bring back the knowledge. So when it comes to name dropping of at least like architectural elements that we can find within the neighborhoods, it's still, I don't, it's going to sound funny, but it's still Yugoslavia. So this Balkan mentality is that we tend to do things and maybe afterwards we name them. But the thing is, at the time there was the role of urbanistic institutes that was a very, basically literally urbanistic institutes that employed an enormous amount of architects and urbanists, and they were working as a whole. So that there is this, again, this idea of socialism and working together to produce a product for the people. So it's very rarely just emphasizing a few of the names or a few of the elements, but it's kind of like, let's experiment with this, let's experiment with the next unit and the next one. And they do name now I'm babbling, but the point is, they weren't just trying to find one thing and stick to it. They were really trying to just test out the grounds, and throughout those 40 years realize what works and what not. So maybe it's not that much about theory, it's more about doing, at least in the territory that I am writing about. And that's unfortunate, because now, after socialism, there's none of that. We don't have that anymore, and that's why I think it's important to write about these things, to bring it back.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I think maybe if you could foreground that, I think maybe in the writing, it's. I have to confess, I didn't go through all your the thesis, so I read the bulk of it. But what I'm saying is, I might have missed that within your text. But I think it's when you're talking about it now, it's really fascinating, and I think it should be highlighted.
I'd like to clarify.
Yeah. Tamara, the only comment I could come up with really was that we don't really hear the voices of the Bedouin themselves. We see the designs, but it might be the way you're presenting it, but it's your voiceover kind of thing. And I wondered if that would help, if you can somehow get their voices to come across. I really don't know the context enough to know whether there's been much written about them, or interviews with, published or recorded or whatever, to know how easy that is to get hold of that kind of thing. But again, that helps with the writing, with engaging the reader as well as being much more convincing. So that for me was the kind of key takeaway for that. But a great piece of writing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dariya. I mean, again, these are all brilliant pieces of writing, and it's a real struggle to say something, especially when you've been taken on a tour of the garden and not really had time to think about what you've said. Reading the essay, reading the thesis, I was much clearer. I think you really kind of highlight the idea of walking as a kind of tool of organizing your thoughts, but also organizing your thoughts in relation to boundaries and space and all the kind of issues that are important to us today. To be honest, I'd kind of like to come back to. I'm still thinking about it, so I would kind of got to pass over to my colleague here. I've got a lot of ideas about it, but I can't express it at the moment. If you bear with me,
Thank you. So thank you all for your presentations. Thomas, firstly, I actually did a similar approach where I condensed like all my research into the thesis, and I think you probably realize it's very fulfilling, and it's also good with time, because you don't really have time in fifth year, as you're probably realizing now. But I just enjoyed the depth by which you went to the nth degree to rigorously research something. It's the same dog. And really try to extrapolate as much information as possible and convey that into like some kind of architectural logic. I was wondering as well with your analysis if it then became quantitative in the sense of if the properties you chose to then introduce your interventions, was the number of those quantities based off the statistics of domestic violence within the UK or within London? Was there a prescribed method by which these numbers were collected? Were then these spaces within the localized area, or was it within a larger region? It's clear that you're very passionate about this subject matter, and it's a very important one for obvious reasons. I was wondering if you're interested to even take this further beyond the rounds of like student work. And secondly, with Masha, I liked sort of the documentary style approach. You sort of did this in this historical research of how almost trial and error has led to some the rise, but the unfortunate fall of social housing, and its benefits are quite clear to see. I didn't want to initially assume you were from that region, but I think in answering Ed, you said we, so I think you are, good. I was wondering actually if do you have long-term intentions to work with this region in social housing, or would you prefer to do something else? I'm quite intrigued to know that as well. And 2 seconds. And tomorrow, hello. Can't see you, but I think your work was really captivating. As Ed said, I think the voices of native groups, thematic groups, are often unheard. And obviously, look, there are limitations by what you can do. So obviously, the idea of you being able to convey their voices directly is easier said than done. I think there are a lot of, from my prior research, a lot of things that reminded me of the work of Hassan Fatty when he tried to do something almost very similar in Egypt with similar intentions. The architecture was of similar sentiment, and again, that didn't work out as much as he's highly lauded now, looking back, but for the similar reasons, people on site may not have the best opinions of him, but it's Western opinions of Hassan Fatty that are lauded, ironically, right? I think I've read in Ghana, they tried to do something similar for rural groups to create this sort of homogenized housing typology. It didn't work. And it just begs the question, do we actually have to force people to live a certain kind of way? Or if we maybe try to create a new kind of typology, should it be in keeping with what they're doing, or do we actually have to do anything at all? But a very interesting piece of work, thank you. And lastly, find the right page, sorry. Whoops, I'll pick it up later. Bear with me, find my notes. I've written a lot of notes, which helps. 2 seconds. Dariya. There we go. Thanks. So I think the depths by which you went to explore the act of walking was very commendable. I know I could never have done that myself. So I think just how it exists in its different forms and how it has this sort of programmatic, this architectural, this spatial, this landscape logic, and how it's not only about the individual, it's about the group and the people we interact, about the whole, the fullness of the experience. And I think it was quite a brave move to encourage us to go into the Bedford Square. I think it's quite interesting actually to see the reactions of other people, the shock, the, oh no, it's 6 p.m., why am I have to stand up? But I think also on that note, maybe it would actually, if you had the tools, it would actually be even nice to even present this outside in the square, and for us to maybe walk amongst the square whilst you're speaking about this. But yeah, no, I want to thank you again for your work. So, thank you.
Just to kind of respond to both comments at the same time. Thanks, Ed, for bringing up Alice Coleman. No, thank you. I'm not actually as familiar with her work as I probably should be. But I do agree. I think that the thesis takes on, or begins to take on, I think, a kind of forensic approach to how the house has become a tool within abuse. I try and state clearly within it that architecture is not the reason for abuse, and I don't claim it to be. But architecture itself has been abused to inflict harm. And I do think that, leading on to Richard's point, that continuing on the project, and this is something that I am wanting to continue on beyond this year, and something that I'm already trying to actively pursue and making steps for continuing it. And if you have any advice afterwards for the next steps, I'd really appreciate that. But continuing on, I do think that this forensic approach to really assess the home, to assess different kinds of properties. The properties were chosen according to areas of high statistics, but also according to social housing that fits the criteria for the redevelopment scheme for how it can be amended. And so that's between kind of certain years of the build.
So the choice of housing can definitely expand further and then start to elaborate on this forensic approach that is able to be taken to really assess the home as a tool, but also as a form of escape and also a form of recovery. And that's, I think, where I really want to kind of lead the conversation to go, is how can architecture truly form an architecture of care to help aid recovery for people who've already experienced so much trauma, as opposed to adding to the trauma that they've gone through. But thank you both for your comments.
I'll try to answer both questions kind of at the same time, but I do agree, like, the Bedouin don't have a voice, but it's a cultural thing. Like, I can only talk about the Emirati Bedouins, but in the UAE, it's a very, very private culture. So it's the reason for there not being any literature or research on them is because they're against it, essentially. But I do agree, I would have loved to have the opportunity to either go into one of their homes or speak to them, but they're very private and very reserved. And I think that's just something that we have to accept, I guess. They like their privacy. And I think the point of my thesis is exactly what you're saying, is that this is a situation that doesn't have a start or finish. It's not limited to one case study in the UAE, but I'm using a case study in a context that I'm familiar with to highlight this relationship between state and inhabitant, but in specifically indigenous or nomadic people. And yeah, I think the point of my thesis is to come to a conclusion, not a conclusion, it's the wrong word, but to come to a point where I kind of open up this new lens into the topic. There's no resolution. I don't offer a resolution, I don't offer a conclusion, but I offer a list of all these actions and reactions and things that happened that will continue to happen after today and have been happening since before Sheikh Zayed built Sha'bi House and in Ghana and in Egypt. So yeah, I think it's just a starting point for another conversation, and I chose to use the context I grew up in. But yeah, thank you.
Should I? To quickly answer your question, I continued with the research on social housing. And so if the piece of writing that you read stops exactly with the independence in 91, that's where I continued. And initially, I wanted it to be a part of the thesis that you read, but somehow there's something so beautiful about the history that is the socialist neighborhood units, that when I started researching the social and non-profit housing that we had since the capitalist regime began, it just became so sad and dry, and somehow I kind of wanted to keep it as like this intact part. However, I did continue, so my project also continues, and my project did become a social housing neighborhood. And the whole aim and what I think the country should pursue is actually bring back the large neighborhood units to, through them, expand the city, and again, almost revive a couple of the ideas that were happening during socialism, but not being too, I'm not trying to glorify too much what was happening there and there. Like, we need to work with what is happening right now. So yes, I did continue.
I'll respond very quickly. I think there are two things. One is maybe what I learned. It's a very nice idea to present outside. I was thinking about it. David Green suggested me to take my phone away and just leave the room. But I think there is something about learning about the protest and the history of the protest. I see the balance, and the most influential protests, they're the ones that followed some of the rules but then crossed the others. So I took 10 minutes of your time. I already crossed many rules. Then probably I also see my role as a kind of communicator with the space. So if I ask you to step out of your comfort zone, I also need to be very sensitive in the sense that I'm not asking too much, and it's actually a space to grow and to enjoy, but not struggle. Thank you.
I think I'd proved I was a living embodiment of being out of my safe environment and being unable to think of what to say afterwards. But I think that's really true. I mean, it's kind of transformative. You go out there and you lose your train of thought. You lose kind of, you're totally changed by, you're refreshed and come back and see things differently. But there is a connection to the past as well. You make a lot of play with the archive and showing all the old photographs of AA students over the years. Doing similar kind of things. And, the whole act of walking, it leaves a trace, doesn't it? And you have paths, ancient paths that you can see carved in the landscape that can be many centuries, hundreds of centuries, thousands of years old. And by animals as well. So you're making a trace. But, yeah, so it's somehow... It's really hard to describe how it affects, I think, in the usual architectural vocabulary, and that's partly why I'm struggling, I think. But there is some deep connection, I think, with the past and with the future, and you just tend to think about. We've seen other presentations today looking at Instagram culture and seeing two-dimensional objects, architecture in 2 dimensions. When you're actually going through a landscape, it's a totally different experience, and maybe that's another field that you might want to comment on how that is so special and how it's disconcerting.
It's definitely 3-dimensional. There may be more than 3 dimensions to it. I think maybe when we print a picture, it becomes 2D from the real object, then we kind of become, maybe we don't allow the person to experience it fully, or experience it in a different way, translating it. You're not reading an original language anymore. So I was very curious what people would take from the original picture. Whatever is there, the landscape that is there, it's maybe a nature, not nature. It can be an open conversation. But you take a train, you see the people, you talk with the locals, you lose your path on the way. I think it gives more layers than a picture. That I'm just curious what other people can see, because all this journey started from me going with Luciana to see her site, and then we kind of had 2 perspectives on the same spot. And then I said, wow, what if there are 5 of us? Does it mean that we will look at it from 5 different sides? And then what if we look at each of our sides from different directions? And we're different people, we have different backgrounds and different paths walked. So I just see the possibility in it to maybe, find new way of representation. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to everybody. I appreciated all the work in the first read, and I really also appreciated, especially in this group, how well you all sort of synthesized what you wanted to say and presented almost a new work for us today. Particularly Tamara. I was so struck with visually how engaging your work was to read in the PDF, and then you presented a completely different work today, which was just as engaging. So that was really nice to see. And I think you mentioned something about it being a lesson in resilience. And I think in a way it's one of the things that joins everyone together around the table, that you're all somehow looking for some sort of engagement between, I don't know, whether modernity or socialism and tradition. And it seems to all relate around a communal act of being and ways of being together. And I think there's something really powerful in that, and I just want to encourage you all to continue acting on your best instincts and doing what you're doing, because I think it's spectacular and brilliant. I'll leave others to say more specific things, and I'd be really happy to talk later individually, but just in the interest of time.
I'll be really, really fast. Tomorrow, I wanted to say, I wish that I'd seen your presentation before I went to UAE, and it answered lots of questions. My only question was, I wanted to know more about how perhaps the Emiratis' own housing, say, compared to expat housing, how perhaps it conflated with Bedouin housing, and where the touch points and the plans converged and the commonalities, because it's just so fascinating. There's so much more, basically. With your work, I thought it was fantastic, and the fact that you've even got to the point of doing design guides, you know, you've asked the questions, you've really kind of tried to think, how, as an architect, can I act and solve problems, is wonderful. The only thing I wondered was looking at sort of historically, almost looking at things like women's refuges, and perhaps, you know, how those as building types, they're probably not the answer, but what's good about them, what's not so good about them as well. And again, I think with the historic paths, what about pilgrimages? And also now the city being defined much more about the space that you can walk, 15-minute cities, etc., etc. Could walking define our urban experiences, but also the building as well, and development? You know, there's so much there. And again, with neighbourhoods, and, you know, I just hope you're going to go back to Slovenia and start designing wonderful neighbourhoods.
So we're super late, so I'm going to be super fast. I'm going to ask. So it's so interesting. I've been here since 10. So see the whole arc. This is not an appeal for sympathy. This is like to say, wow, like to see the whole arc of work, and it's just so interesting to see the peaks and troughs of when people choose to experiment with certain things, when they choose to use theory, when they don't. And it's just so interesting to see how serious your four reports are, in a sense. And serious because of the subject matter in some cases, but serious in the fact that they have some kind of a propositional prerogative, probably because you're aiming for honors in design, and so how do you think both ways at once? The theory's kind of toned down. And to an extent, they have a kind of report-like quality, right? A kind of normative quality, right? So it's something that one should do something with, right? There's a kind of manifesto quality, or at least kind of the potential for people to replicate something about what you're talking about. And identification of really, really special particular things, what I like, is not flattening, right? So you're pulling out things that maybe defy the consensus. For example, in your case, the idea that you can actually design to help people, super specifically in a super difficult situation. So I'm going to ask each of you one question that is like specifically designed to go right to the heart of the tension of your projects. I hope, I'd like it to at least. It's a normative question, it's a should question. And then you can answer yes or no, but one sentence only. or just be like, I don't know, it's fine, it's okay. It's okay, we don't have to have a clear yes or no. But I'm just going to try. Okay, I'm just going to try. And then maybe meditate on that question in terms of what you do with your essay in the future. Let me see if I can remember that. So I'm going to go in order of presentation. Okay, so if your manual ends up in the hands of an art conservative, patriarchal, victim-blaming local councillor, should we still carry through with the design?
Answer now.
Yeah, if you want. I mean, I know it's a super hard question, or it's okay not to answer. It's just, right, should it end up in the hands of someone that you don't agree with? What do you think?
The guide.
Yeah, the guide.
I'd say yes, and I'd say yes because the way in which the guide has been formed is so that whether it's structured towards post-abuse recovery, but it's been formed through
taking the fragments which are used as harm and simply just redesigning them to prevent as much harm taking place, but also to cause an architecture of care that I think can be taken outside of just domestic abuse survivors. And so ultimately, if the guide is followed, ideally it's not in someone's hands. This is a long sentence, I'll stop. Ideally it's not in someone's hands, so I don't agree with, but...
There's supposed to be mean questions.
Yeah, I think that the answer, I think, from first thinking and with little time is yes.
Okay, cool. And there's no right or wrong, and then they're mean, so intentionally mean. Who was second? Masha, okay, so... should the sanctity of private property be questioned and curtailed in Slovenia or ex-Yugoslavia today to build the neighborhoods you want? Right, so you talk about this very special kind of hybrid market-state relationship. Should Tito's project, should some of it still exist? It's very delicate and very tricky, but because that's obviously what you're playing with, right? You're playing with that idea.
You mean in a physical form or the structure?
It's up to you to answer the way you want to answer.
It should, because it would be interesting, but I don't think it can.
Okay. Tamara? Mm-hmm. Okay. So also a lot of the things that I was wondering have already come up. So should the lesson of nomadic housing in the Khalij be applied to the new nomads of the Khalij? Refugees and migrant workers. Should this approach to housing people be considered in treating the migrant worker?
Okay, should I answer also the question before or? So first, I'll start from there and then I'll go to it because maybe it would link. So the difference in general between housing for the expats in Dubai and housing for the Bedouin since its initial, even for Emiratis today, the difference is always that the role of social housing in the UAE was always to establish class structure within the classless society of the Bedouin tribes because they were all equal in rank. It was based on kinship. And so basically, the idea of Emirati social housing was always because the Emiratis are maybe 8% of the population, around 8 to 10%. So the government, in order to preserve the nationality, directly established the Bedouin as the upper class. And with the expats, that's never the case. Till today, the expats, I mean, it's well known. And so yeah, that's the difference between the way till today housing is dealt with. And if I think this way of housing should be applied to expats, I mean, it kind of is, because what happened is now the Shabi houses, expats inhabit them because they're no longer upper class. The modern villas came in, so then the local families who owned it gave it to the expats. So it kind of is what happened. I know that's not what you meant, but it's now in the urban landscape, whatever remains of Shabi houses are rented out to migrants because now it's a like a lower class. And generally they're in worse areas and they're in worse conditions because maintenance and so yeah. But I do wish that a better. I mean, I do think it would be nice to have some kind of housing scheme for them, but no, they will never be like the Imara. I don't think the government will ever do.
I told you that'd be vexing ones. There's no right answer. And then for you, should we, if we go on a walk to trace these paths, should we bring bolt cutters, super glue, zip ties, saws?
What's the first word?
We're on video, we're being recorded. So were someone to bring saws, bolt cutters, zip ties on a walk, on a ramble to try to trace a path, would you be upset should they damage private property in doing so?
I'm back.
So you had the key here, but not everyone has the key. Should people just jump over the fence?
Yeah, that was absolutely not real because I had a key. Yeah. I think that any force is measured by the force on the other side. So if there is no gates, then there is no need to cut the gates. And I assume if there is a bit weaker fight for the private land, then there is no danger in coming with the knives because there is nothing to cut.
Okay.
Walking through the land these days with all these amazing people, we didn't need it.
Okay. Apologize for torturing you, but you guys are the big stars of the day, so you can handle the pressure.
Can I, just before we conclude, can I
Sure.
just respond to Helen's comments? Just that I'm really grateful for what you were saying about refuge shelters, and I'm extremely grateful to people who have been willing to go through interviews with me in this process. And I do find that refuge shelters, being a man, is hard for me to access. But at the same time, what I found really interesting through the research and the thesis is how the refuge shelter is set up for a short-term response, and it's designed in such a way with shared facilities, with the amount of people in one building. But it's not able to fulfill the purpose it's designed for because there's no long-term response. So people are staying there long-term, and then the structure changes, the way in which it operates changes. So I do agree that I think refuge shelters to dig more into can really start to inform the longer-term response. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, aware of time, we'll conclude there, unless our critics have any final kind of comments they'd like to make overall, or... All right, good. Well, first I'd like to thank our critics. So Nick, who's been here since 10, wins an award. Thank you very much. And thank you, Helen. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Ed. And most of all, thanks to all the students who presented today. It's been, what? Thank you. It's been, really, I would say, inspiring, actually, to see being in HTS for about, 12 years now and teaching and seeing quite a transformation in the type of essays and topics that students are willing to take on board, really challenging topics across the board today. Seeing how using architecture as a means to kind of sort of explore really important social issues that surround us today. But also using HTS and writing and the act of writing to challenge our profession, which obviously is in dire need of some questions. And it's quite consistent across the board through all the work we saw today. So I think it's quite clear the direction sort of we're going, and that's thanks to all the students and their work. So. And all the great tutors. Yes. Yes, very good point. Yes, and thank you to all our tutors. All right, so we'll wrap it up there. If I can sort of rudely, sorry, I apologize, ask everyone to leave so the panel can deliberate. And all the results will be emailed to the school community at a later date, hopefully soon, in the next couple of days.